I knew my sister was back before anyone said her name, because Emmy's hand suddenly tightened around mine. Lauren stood across my mother's backyard beside a man I had never met, staring at the 6-year-old she had left with me before Emmy could even say, "Mama." Then she walked over, crouched as if she belonged there, and smiled. "It's time you came home with me." 4 weeks later, an unknown number sent me a photograph of Emmy, with bruises across her arms and back. I grabbed my keys. Then I stopped, because if I did this wrong, I might save her for one night and lose the chance to protect her for good. Before I tell you how we got from my mother's backyard to that photograph, I hope you'll stay with me to the end. And if stories about families, hard choices, and the people who show us what love really costs mean something to you, I'd be glad to have you subscribe and stay with us. That Saturday had started with blueberry syrup on my kitchen counter, and Emmy complaining that one pancake looked more like Ohio than a rabbit. She was sitting sideways on a stool in mismatched socks, one foot hooked around the lower rung, her hair still flattened on one side from sleep. At 6, she had developed very firm opinions about breakfast geometry. A round pancake was boring. A rabbit was acceptable. A dinosaur was ideal. What I had actually produced looked like a damaged cloud, but she was willing to negotiate as long as I added strawberries. I cut them while she drew a house on the back of an old grocery list. Emmy drew houses constantly, not grand ones, usually square little places with crooked roofs, too many windows, and every room carefully divided by thick crayon lines. She always drew beds, tables, lamps, a refrigerator with food inside. Once I asked why she never drew people outside the houses. She looked at me as though the answer were obvious. Because they live there. That was Emmy. The questions I thought were complicated tended to be simple to her. The things I assumed were simple sometimes kept her awake at night. She finished half her breakfast, forgot the other half existed, and slid down from the stool to find the yellow sandals I had told her 3 times were beside the front door. I wrapped the leftover pancakes and put them in the refrigerator, already knowing she would ask for them the next morning, as if breakfast leftovers were a personal discovery. There was nothing remarkable about any of it, and that was what I loved most. By then, nearly every part of my life had settled around Emmy so gradually that I could no longer remember where adjustment had ended and motherhood had begun. Her lunchbox sat beside my work bag every weekday morning. Her purple toothbrush leaned into mine in the bathroom cup. I knew which library books would keep her awake because she would sneak a flashlight under the blanket to finish them. I knew she hated the seam inside one particular pair of socks, that thunder made her quiet instead of frightened, and that she would eat broccoli willingly, as long as the florets did not touch her mashed potatoes. None of those things had arrived with a ceremony. There had never been a day when someone handed me Emmy and declared that from now on, I was her mother. There had only been thousands of ordinary days in which somebody had to stay. I stayed. That afternoon, Mom was having one of her backyard gatherings, the kind that began as lunch and usually stretched until someone turned on the porch lights. August heat sat heavily over the neighborhood, and the air smelled of charcoal, cut grass, and the basil Mom grew in mismatched ceramic pots along the patio. Emmy knew my mother as Grandma Diane. She had spent enough weekends in that backyard to know exactly where the stepping stones became slippery after the sprinklers ran, and which cabinet in the kitchen held the plastic cups with cartoon animals. She let go of my hand as soon as we came through the side gate and ran toward Mom, who bent to catch her with both arms. For the next hour, nothing felt unusual. Emmy chalked flowers onto the concrete with 2 cousins, carried napkins to the patio table because Mom gave her jobs whenever she visited, and came back twice to press a cold hand against my arm after digging through the ice chest. I remember thinking how good normal felt. Then her fingers closed around mine. She had returned quietly enough that I had not noticed her until she was standing against my hip. Her hand was sticky from watermelon, but the grip was tight. I followed her gaze, Lauren stood near the far edge of the patio. For a second, my mind refused to arrange what I was seeing into something real. My sister looked older than the last version of her I carried around in my memory, though not dramatically so. Her hair was shorter. Her clothes were more polished than they used to be, simple in the expensive-looking way that required more effort than it admitted. She had one hand folded loosely in front of her. Beside her stood a tall man in a pale button-down shirt, with his sleeves turned back neatly at the forearms. He was not touching her. Still, there was something about the way Lauren occupied the space beside him that made me notice him before I wanted to. Mom had not told me Lauren was coming. I knew that immediately, because Diane Hale was incapable of hiding a surprise without radiating guilt for 3 days beforehand. When I looked toward her, Mom was standing by the patio table with a serving spoon frozen above a bowl of potato salad. That told me everything. Lauren had surprised her too. Emmy moved closer until her shoulder pressed into my leg. She knew Lauren's face only from a handful of photographs. I had never hidden that she had another mother. I had also never filled a 6-year-old child's head with the ugliest version of why that mother was gone. When Emmy had asked, I told her Lauren had not been ready to take care of a baby and that I had been there when she needed someone. It was the kindest version I knew how to give her. For years, I believed kindness and truth were the same thing, as long as you left out enough sharp edges. Lauren looked directly at Emmy, not me, not Mom. Emmy. Her expression changed in a way I could not read. Her lips parted. She took one slow breath and walked across the yard. The man followed several steps behind. I could feel Emmy studying my body for instructions. Children do that long before they understand they are doing it. They learn whether a stranger is safe from the tension in your hand, whether a sound means danger from how quickly you turn your head. I forced my fingers to loosen around hers. Lauren stopped in front of us. Up close, I could see that her composure had fractures. She blinked too quickly. Her eyes traveled over Emmy's face. Her hair, the scraped knee she had earned trying to jump a sprinkler 2 days earlier. For one brief second, I wondered whether Lauren might cry. Instead, she crouched. She did not ask whether Emmy remembered her. She did not ask whether she could hug her. She smiled as though they had missed an ordinary weekend together. It's time you came home with me. I felt Emmy's hand twist against mine. She did not look at Lauren. She looked up at me. That was the moment the entire afternoon changed. I wish I could tell you I said something perfect. Something controlled and devastating that made everybody understand immediately what was happening. I didn't. My first instinct was so physical that I had to resist moving Emmy behind me. Lauren straightened before I managed to answer. The man beside her stepped closer, not threateningly. Not in any way I could have objected to, without sounding unreasonable. That would become something I remembered later. Adrian Voss never needed to move very far to change the shape of a room. Mom came over first. Her face carried the strained hope of someone trying to stop a family fracture by holding both sides together with bare hands. She told Lauren that this was not the place to spring something like that on Emmy. But underneath the disapproval was hope. Mom had spent years grieving Lauren without admitting that was what she was doing. There had been birthdays when she set aside a plate automatically before remembering Lauren had not called. Christmas mornings when she checked her phone between presents. Every few months, she would tell me about some harmless message Lauren had sent. Happy birthday, hope everyone's well, as if 3 sentences proved her daughter was finding her way back. Mom believed in return. It was one of the things I loved about her. That afternoon it frightened me. The rest of the family did what families do when something unbearable happens beside the potato salad. They became busy. Someone carried plates inside. Someone called the children toward the yard. My uncle stared at the grill, as though burgers required his complete moral attention. No one formed a circle around us and chose sides. That would have been easier. Mom said Lauren deserved the chance to explain herself. Another relative murmured that maybe Lauren should have contacted me privately first. Someone else asked that we not turn the gathering into a fight. All three positions sounded reasonable enough if you did not know what it had taken to make Emmy's life ordinary. I told Lauren we were not discussing where Emmy would live in front of Emmy. That was all. I did not ask why she had returned. I did not remind her that she had missed 5 Christmases and 6 birthdays. I did not tell her she had forfeited the right to use the word home, as if she had left one waiting for Emmy somewhere. Emmy was still holding my hand. That mattered more. The man finally introduced himself as Adrian. He did it quietly, without extending the moment. He said he and Lauren were married, and I realized Mom had not known that either. The information landed strangely. My sister had acquired an entire marriage, somewhere outside the edges of our family. Adrian explained that they had hoped the day could be the beginning of making things right. Lauren stayed beside him. I waited for her to correct the implication that I was one of the things that needed correcting. She didn't. Later, after Emmy had gone inside with Mom to wash chalk dust from her hands, I tried to speak to Lauren alone. I did not get the chance. Adrian came with her to the quieter side of the yard, near the fence where Mom's hydrangeas had burned brown at the edges in the heat. I kept my voice low. I asked Lauren why she had appeared without warning, and why she had spoken to Emmy as though a decision had already been made. Lauren opened her mouth. Adrian answered. He said there had been too much misunderstanding in the past, and that they were not interested in fighting. What mattered, he said, was giving Emmy the stable family structure she deserved. The words themselves were almost impossible to object to. Stable, family, deserved. I looked at Lauren. She was watching Adrian. Only after he finished did she turn to me. She said they wanted to do things properly. I remember the exact irritation that moved through me. Then not fear, not yet. Irritation. The kind you feel when somebody enters your house and begins explaining where your furniture should go. I asked Lauren to call me when she was ready to speak without an audience. Adrian smiled faintly. Lauren said nothing. That ended the conversation. For the rest of the afternoon, I stayed close to Emmy without hovering. Lauren did not try the come home line again. She watched Emmy from a distance while Emmy returned to chalk drawings and watermelon, though the easy looseness had gone out of her movements. On the drive home, she sat unusually still in the back seat. I waited. By then, I had learned that if Emmy had a question, silence often brought it sooner than asking. We stopped at a red light 3 blocks from our house. Was that Lauren? I looked at her in the mirror. Yes. She considered that for another block. Then she asked if Lauren lived at Grandma's house now. No, sweetheart. That seemed to satisfy her for the moment. At home, she abandoned her sandals beside the couch, asked for macaroni, and spent 20 minutes coloring the roof of another house purple. Children can move around adult disasters with breathtaking efficiency when they do not yet understand the size of them. I was the one who could not settle. That night, after Emmy fell asleep, I stood in her doorway longer than I needed to. Her room was not large. One wall had a crooked row of drawings taped to it. A stuffed fox leaned against her pillow. Her reading lamp was still on because she had negotiated for 5 more pages and fallen asleep after 2. I crossed the room, turned off the lamp, and pulled the blanket over her foot. There had been a time when Lauren slept beside her. 8 months. That was how old Emmy had been when my sister arrived at my apartment with a diaper bag, a portable crib, and the exhausted face of someone who had run out of answers. She told me she needed a few weeks. She needed sleep. She needed to figure out work. She needed to find herself again. I believed her. For the first month, Lauren called almost every day, then every few days, then sometimes. Each time the date she planned to return moved farther away. I stopped keeping track of promises and started keeping track of formula, doctor appointments, fevers, sleep schedules, and which songs calmed Emmy fastest in the middle of the night. I never made a dramatic decision to become her mother. There was simply a morning when Emmy woke with a fever, and the pediatrician needed consent. Another when childcare paperwork needed a legal signature. Another when my landlord needed documentation. Until eventually the gap between the person raising her and the person legally authorized to make decisions could not be ignored. That was when guardianship stopped being an abstract word. It became the piece of paper that allowed me to keep doing what I was already doing. Lauren knew I was seeking guardianship. I had asked her more than once to come back and take part instead of disappearing into shorter calls and longer silences. She did not return to do that. Eventually, the calls stopped altogether. I had spent years explaining that history to Emmy in gentler language. Your mom wasn't ready. Your mom was having a hard time. Your mom needed to go away for a while. I thought I was protecting her from believing she had been unwanted. Standing beside her bed that night, I wondered for the first time whether there was a difference between protecting a child from pain and protecting an adult from the consequences of what she had done. I did not yet know the answer. 3 days after the backyard gathering, someone knocked on my door at 7:18 the evening. Emmy was in the bathtub singing badly enough to make me smile despite myself. The man outside asked if I was Rebecca Hale. He handed me an envelope. It took less than 30 seconds. I knew what it was before I opened it. There are moments when your body understands a threat before your mind has finished reading. My mouth went dry first, then my hands turned cold. I sat at the kitchen table while bathwater splashed faintly down the hallway and read Lauren's name at the top of a petition, asking the court to terminate my guardianship and restore her ability to resume custody of Emmy. I read the first page twice, then a third time. By the time I called Tessa Morgan the next morning, I had underlined so much of the paperwork that the pages looked wounded. Tessa had helped me with guardianship questions before, though nothing like this. She did not tell me I was definitely going to win. I respected her more for that. She explained the part I least wanted to hear. My guardianship mattered. 6 years of stability mattered. Emmy's attachment and best interests mattered. But guardianship was not adoption. Lauren's parental rights had never simply vanished because she had failed to use them. She could ask the court to change the arrangement. That did not mean a judge would hand Emmy to her. It did mean I could not throw the petition in the trash and pretend my sister had no legal doorway back into our lives. The distinction sat like a stone in my chest. After the call, I drove to work and spent the morning doing ordinary things, while my entire understanding of permanence shifted under me. I approved invoices. I fixed a scheduling error. I reminded one of the junior architects that the copier jammed if he overloaded the top tray. At 11:30, I opened the petition again. Not because I needed to understand the procedure, because I needed to understand Lauren. Her declaration was several pages behind the request itself. At first, it sounded almost reasonable. She described herself as stable now, married, employed, ready to repair her relationship with her daughter. I kept reading. Then I reached the paragraph about the year Emmy had been born. Lauren described herself as overwhelmed and temporarily unable to care for an infant. She wrote that I had offered to help. That part was true. Then the story bent. According to Lauren, temporary help had gradually become long-term separation because I had discouraged her attempts to resume parenting and convinced her she was not capable of caring for Emmy. I read the sentence again, then another. She wrote that she had never intended to surrender the role of mother. She wrote that I had used guardianship to reinforce an arrangement she had not truly wanted. For several seconds, the office disappeared around me. I could hear the air conditioning vent above my desk and the faint click of keyboards from the other side of the partition. I thought of every unanswered message, every time I had asked when she was coming back, every promise that became another month, every form I had signed because Lauren was somewhere else, living a life I knew almost nothing about. And now, on official paper, my sister had taken the years she abandoned and rearranged them until she was the mother who had lost her child and I was the woman who had kept her. Lauren had not simply come back. She had returned with a new version of the past. And this time, she wanted a judge to believe it. For the next several days, Lauren's declaration followed me through dinner, work, and Emmy's bedtime routine. The danger was not simply that she had lied, it was that she had built the lie around true fragments. She had been overwhelmed, I had offered to help, and the first arrangement had been temporary. In the wrong order, those facts could make her version sound possible. Tessa told me not to build my defense around outrage. The court would not care which sister had the more satisfying argument at Thanksgiving or who had ignored whose birthday 6 years earlier. What mattered was Emmy's history, Lauren's current circumstances, the nature of the existing guardianship, and whether changing it would serve Emmy rather than punish or reward either adult. She also warned me against the thought I had been carrying since the envelope arrived. No, Lauren could not simply walk into court and leave with Emmy. But no, I could not insist that Lauren remain a photograph forever merely because that was easier for me. Those two truths left very little room to breathe. The first hearing was nothing like the dramatic courtroom battles people imagine when they hear the word custody. Most of the important work had happened in paperwork before we entered the room. The result was cautious rather than decisive. Lauren would begin supervised contact while the petition remained pending, and a court-appointed child advocate named June Mercer would focus on Emmy's adjustment and interests rather than either sister's claims. The temporary plan could expand only if the early visits remained uneventful. No overnight visits yet, no immediate change in guardianship, and no promise about what came later. I walked out relieved that Emmy was still coming home with me. I also walked out, knowing Lauren now had an official doorway into her life. The first supervised visit took place several days later in a family services room designed to look less institutional than it actually was. Somebody had put bright rugs over industrial carpet and stocked low shelves with puzzles, washable markers, dolls, blocks, and books. There were drawings taped to one wall, probably left by children who had passed through under circumstances none of them had chosen. I had prepared Emmy carefully without preparing her too much. I told her she would spend some time with Lauren and that I would be nearby. I told her she did not have to perform, impress anyone, or answer questions she did not understand. I told her she was allowed to feel, however she felt. Then I spent the entire drive wondering whether giving her permission to feel anything was just a more elegant way of saying I was terrified of what she might feel. Emmy carried a sheet of folded drawing paper under one arm. She had been sketching another house that morning, this one with an enormous tree beside it and a tiny pink mailbox. When we entered the room, Lauren was already there. Adrian was not. That surprised me. For the first time since the backyard gathering, my sister looked like someone standing entirely inside her own body. She seemed nervous. Not theatrically nervous. Her fingers kept smoothing the same crease in her pants, and when Emmy came in, Lauren started to rise, stopped herself, and waited. That restraint mattered to me. I noticed it despite myself. June introduced herself to Emmy in the uncomplicated way people who are good with children often do. She did not announce that she was there to evaluate anyone. She simply explained that she would sometimes be around, while the adults figured out schedules, and that Emmy could talk to her if she wanted. Then I left the room. Not the building. Just the room. It still felt like walking out of my own skin. There was a waiting area down the hall with 2 hard chairs and a vending machine that hummed louder than necessary. I sat with my phone face down on my knee and watched the minutes pass. At 12 minutes, I convinced myself Emmy might be uncomfortable. At 23, I imagined her sitting silent while Lauren tried to manufacture intimacy. At 30, I nearly stood up. Then I heard laughter through the door. Emmy's laughter. Not the polite little giggle she used when adults were clearly trying to be funny. The full one that came from her stomach and usually ended with a hiccup. I stayed in the chair. The sound hurt more than I had expected. That was the first maternal test Lauren gave me, without even knowing she was giving it. For years I had feared the possibility that Lauren would return and hurt Emmy. I had not prepared myself for the possibility that she might return and make her happy. When the visit ended, Emmy came out carrying a paper crown made from construction paper. Lauren had apparently remembered that when Emmy was a baby, she used to settle whenever someone hummed an old children's song our mother had sung to us. Lauren had turned it into a game. They had decorated paper crowns while humming it badly together. It was a tiny thing, but Lauren had remembered it. I had spent years making abandonment easier to understand by imagining something in her had simply shut off. Memory was harder. Emmy talked about the crown all the way home. She did not talk about Lauren much beyond that. She described the markers, the game, the snack, and how one crayon had broken when she pushed too hard. I let her choose the shape of the conversation. That evening, she taped the crown to the wall beside one of her house drawings. I looked at it while I folded laundry on her bed. The ugly emotion arrived quietly. Jealousy does not always feel hot. Sometimes it feels like standing in the bedroom you built for a child and noticing there is suddenly one object in it that came from somebody else. I folded another shirt, then another. I reminded myself that Emmy's happiness was not a resource Lauren could steal from me. A few days later, while I was pouring cereal before school, Emmy asked if she could see Lauren again. She said it without ceremony, no trembling voice. No guilt yet. Just the ordinary expectation of a child asking whether something pleasant could happen twice. My hand stopped over the bowl for half a second. I made myself finish pouring. I told her yes, if the grown-ups working out the schedule agreed. She smiled and returned to arranging banana slices into a face. I carried the question to work with me. After nearly 6 years of being the person Emmy reached for first, I had to admit there was a small, selfish part of me that wanted Lauren to fail just enough to prove I had been right. Recognizing that did not make it disappear. It made me responsible for what I did with it. So when the second supervised visit was approved, I did not object. Lauren's second visit went well too. June later described Emmy as cautious at first, but increasingly relaxed. Lauren followed Emmy's lead instead of overwhelming her with affection. She did not insist on a hug. She did not correct Emmy when she called her Lauren. I listened to June's summary and felt my own position becoming less morally comfortable. If Lauren had arrived cruel, unstable, or obviously uninterested in Emmy herself, I would have known what to do. Instead, she was doing things correctly, at least where anyone could see them. Even Tessa told me that cooperation mattered. Not because I had to trust Lauren, but because if I claimed every contact was dangerous while neutral observers saw something else, I would begin looking less protective and more obstructive. I hated how sensible that was. Mom loved it. Diane had been trying not to say, "I told you so," since the first visit, which meant she found subtler ways to say it. She brought over a casserole one evening and stayed after Emmy went to bed. We sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I had opened Lauren's petition, and Mom told me she had spoken to Lauren twice that week. Not about the case, she insisted. About life. Lauren had a job. She had been married to Adrian long enough, Mom said, to sound settled in a way she never had when she was younger. She had acknowledged making mistakes. Mom wanted so badly for those facts to become a bridge that I could almost see her building it while she talked. She said people deserved second chances. At that point in the story, neither of us understood yet what a second chance could cost the person being asked to provide it. I reminded Mom that Lauren's second chance could not come at the expense of Emmy's stability. She agreed. But then she said something harder to dismiss. She told me I also did not want Emmy to grow up, and one day wonder whether I had prevented her mother from trying. That sentence stayed with me after Mom left. It annoyed me precisely because I could not prove it wrong. The next morning, Emmy asked a question that made it worse. She was sitting on the bathroom counter while I combed a knot from the back of her hair. She had insisted she could brush it herself and then created what looked like a bird's nest near her left ear. She watched me in the mirror. "Can Lauren be Mom too?" The comb stopped. I looked at her reflection. Her expression carried no agenda. No accusation. She was 6 years old, trying to understand whether one word could fit more than one person without breaking something. I asked what made her wonder. She said Lauren had told her she could call her whatever felt comfortable, and Emmy had thought about trying Mom next time. Then she lowered her eyes. Would that make you sad? There it was. The thing I had promised myself I would never make her responsible for. I set the comb down and turned her carefully so she was facing me. You never have to love someone less just to prove you love me. She studied my face as though checking for a trick. Then she asked if she still had to let me finish the knot. That almost made me laugh. I told her yes. Some rules remained cruelly non-negotiable. She complained about the comb and forgot the heavier question before we reached the kitchen. I did not. All day, my own sentence came back to me. It was easier to say love was not ownership before Emmy was considering giving someone else the name I had answered to for years. Motherhood, for me, lived in fevers, grocery lists, school mornings, and knowing the small details of her body and moods. None of that disappeared because she used one word for Lauren. The pain was mine to carry, not Emmy's. Lauren's visits continued. Not frequently enough for Emmy to build a new routine, but consistently enough that Lauren stopped feeling entirely hypothetical. Emmy began making 2 drawings before some visits, so she could bring one with her. She asked questions about Lauren's house and whether Adrian lived there all the time. I answered what I knew and admitted when I did not. Adrian appeared occasionally at transitions, but was not part of the supervised sessions themselves. He remained unfailingly controlled. He never raised his voice or demanded anything in front of me. That almost bothered me more. People who wanted to dominate a situation usually revealed themselves eventually through impatience. Adrian seemed built out of patience. He waited beside Lauren, carried whatever she handed him, spoke only when necessary. And still, I noticed Lauren looked at him before certain answers. Not every answer, just enough that I kept noticing. I did not yet know what it meant. June did not appear suspicious of him. Tessa had nothing concrete to say about him, except that he was Lauren's spouse, and therefore part of the home environment that would matter if visits expanded later. I did not turn unease into evidence just because it belonged to me. That discipline became harder after June asked Lauren, during one of the routine review conversations, why she had waited so many years to challenge the guardianship. I was present for part of that meeting. Lauren explained that she had spent years believing I would not cooperate. She described earlier attempts to reconnect that, according to her, had ended with me making it clear Emmy was better off without her. I felt my face go still. I remembered the opposite. There had been a birthday when I sent Lauren photographs and asked if she wanted to video call. She replied 3 days later. There had been the winter Emmy was 2, when I told Lauren that if she intended to remain in Emmy's life, we needed something more consistent than a message every few months. There had been at least 2 occasions when I told her she could visit if she gave me enough notice not to confuse Emmy. Lauren had not come. I had records of some of it. Texts, emails, nothing cinematic, nothing that would make a courtroom fall silent. Just the ordinary digital remains of somebody repeatedly choosing not to show up. I did not interrupt Lauren's explanation. June asked a few practical follow-up questions and moved on. But something changed for me in that room. Until then, I had wondered whether Lauren had lied in her declaration because her lawyer told her she needed a stronger argument. Now I understood the rewritten past existed beyond the document. Lauren had begun living inside it. Maybe she had told Adrian. Maybe she had told herself. I did not yet know. What I knew was that the version she described required my messages not to exist in the way I remembered them. Afterward, Tessa told me to preserve everything and let the contradictions speak when they needed to. She did not want me confronting Lauren over every inconsistency. That advice suited my temperament. I had no desire to stand in a parking lot waving 6-year-old text messages at my sister. More importantly, Emmy was beginning to look forward to seeing her. That made every adult conflict more dangerous. The danger I feared was no longer only that Lauren might take Emmy. Lauren could become someone Emmy wanted, and then disappear again, making the old wound new. That fear almost made me pull back, but I could not teach Emmy that love was not ownership and then act as though her affection belonged to me. So I kept taking her to the visits and kept watching. And Lauren, for those first few weeks, kept giving me very little I could honestly call wrong. That was what made the next visit so painful. I was waiting outside the room when it ended. Through the narrow glass panel in the door, I could see Emmy collecting markers from the table while Lauren folded a piece of paper. They had made something together again. June opened the door. Emmy came out first, then suddenly remembered something and turned back. Lauren was still standing near the table. Emmy ran 2 steps toward her. "Mom?" The word was tentative, barely louder than a question. Lauren froze. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Lauren crouched and opened her arms. Emmy went into them. I stood in the hallway with my keys in my hand and smiled because Emmy looked over Lauren's shoulder to see whether I was watching. I made sure the smile stayed there until she looked away. Inside me, something small and private broke. And for the first time since Lauren came back, I understood that losing Emmy did not necessarily begin with a judge taking her away. Sometimes, it could begin with having to love her enough to let her walk willingly toward someone else. For 3 days after Emmy called Lauren Mom, the word followed me through ordinary places. Emmy seemed to forget its significance almost immediately. To her, it had been a question answered by a hug. I was the one who attached history to it. Still, I meant what I had told her. If Lauren could become one more safe person in Emmy's life, my fear could not become a wall around her. That belief became harder to live by when Emmy began enjoying Lauren more openly. The supervised visits continued without incident. Lauren learned quickly which activities made Emmy relax and which questions made her retreat. She stopped asking about the years she had missed and focused on whatever was in front of them. If Emmy wanted to color, they colored. If she wanted to build a crooked block tower, Lauren sat on the floor and helped hold it together. June told me Lauren was not pushing for affection or insisting Emmy perform a daughter's role for her. That should have reassured me. Some days it did. Then the visits expanded. Not overnight. Not yet. But long enough that Lauren could take Emmy out with supervision, rather than remain in the same family services room every time. The first outing was simple. A children's museum, lunch, then back to the agreed pickup point. Emmy came home with a paper bracelet around her wrist and the kind of exhausted excitement that made her speak without punctuation. Lauren had let her press every button in a pretend control room. They had eaten grilled cheese. Adrian had met them for part of lunch. That was the first time his presence became part of Emmy's experience, rather than something standing outside it. I waited for my own body to react before deciding what I thought. Nothing in Emmy's story sounded wrong. She said Adrian knew how to make a straw wrapper jump when he blew into it. She thought that was funny enough to demonstrate twice at dinner, sending a strip of paper across my table and nearly into my water glass. He had also helped her finish a small wooden puzzle in the museum cafe after she became frustrated. "He didn't do it for me," she explained. "He just showed me the corner." I nodded and asked whether she had fun. She had. That night, I admitted why Adrian's kindness bothered me. Part of me wanted the world to simplify itself. Lauren was showing patience. Adrian had helped with a puzzle, and Emmy was happy. I had to live inside uncertainty, instead of assigning everyone the role that made protection easiest. The next visit was longer. Lauren had begun preparing a room for Emmy at the house she shared with Adrian. June mentioned it in a neutral way, as one of the things Lauren believed would make future visits easier. I told myself a room was just a room. Emmy did not see it that way. She came home talking about pale yellow curtains, a low shelf, and a wall Lauren had said they could decorate together. "There's a bed that's mine there," she said it proudly. I stood at the sink rinsing pasta sauce from a plate and watched her reflection in the kitchen window. My first thought came before I could stop it. You already have a bed that's yours. I did not say it. Instead, I asked what she wanted to put on the wall. Emmy considered this seriously. She thought maybe animals, or stars, or both, if Lauren said it was okay. That last phrase was small enough that I nearly missed it. If Lauren said it was okay, it was reasonable. It was Lauren's house. Children ask permission in other people's homes. There was nothing alarming about it. Not yet. A week later, Emmy asked whether the next visit could last a little more. She had begun measuring time according to the parts of visits she did not want to leave. Another snack. Another drawing. One more game. Her wanting more time with Lauren hurt in a quieter way than hearing Mom the first time. I could not resent Lauren for succeeding at the exact thing I had told everyone should be allowed to succeed if it was safe. That was the trap. Every positive step toward Lauren was also a test of whether I truly believed what I said about loving Emmy without owning her. I kept passing the test publicly. Privately, I was less graceful. I caught myself lingering at drop-offs and fishing after visits, with casual questions about food, Adrian, and whether anyone had been upset. Emmy answered with the patience of a child who did not know she was being interviewed. Once I heard myself, I stopped. The next time, I asked only whether she had fun. She had. Around that time, Adrian began appearing more often. Not in a way that violated anything. He was Lauren's husband. If the long-term goal was to evaluate whether Emmy could safely spend time in their home, his existence could not remain off-stage forever. He remained almost irritatingly reasonable. Once, during a handoff, Emmy dropped a small cardboard craft she had made, and one of the taped pieces came loose. She knelt immediately to fix it, frustrated. Adrian crouched several feet away, rather than reaching for it. He told her where the tape had separated, and waited, while she repaired it herself. When she succeeded, he did not clap or turn it into a performance. He simply told her she had figured it out. Nothing about the moment was wrong. It was exactly the kind of help I usually appreciated in adults around Emmy. On the drive home, I tried to reinterpret it into something darker and could not. For a while, I had to allow the possibility that some of my distrust belonged to the circumstances in which I had met Adrian, not to anything I could prove about him. Then the rules started. They arrived through Emmy one at a time. The first rules were ordinary enough. Remain at the table until everyone finished. Put shoes in one place. Do not interrupt. Put one toy away before taking out another. If I had handed those rules to 10 parents, most would have shrugged. The problem was not any single rule. It was what began happening to Emmy around them. One Monday morning, I was packing her lunch when she came into the kitchen carrying 2 shirts. She asked which one was more right. I thought she meant which one matched her skirt. She shook her head and clarified that Adrian liked people to look put together. I crouched and told her both shirts were clean and school, appropriate, so she could choose. She stood there longer than necessary. Finally, she picked the blue one and asked if I was sure. I said yes. She asked again after I had already put the other shirt away. I noticed. I did not yet know what to do with it. Mrs. Park noticed something too. At pickup later that week, she mentioned that Emmy had become unusually careful about asking permission. At first, the teacher framed it almost positively. Emmy had always been polite, but now she was asking before sharpening a pencil, before choosing a book from the class shelf, before moving from one activity to another, even when the class had already been told they could. Mrs. Park had reassured her she did not need permission for every small thing. Emmy had apologized. That word landed differently. Apologized. For asking permission. I asked whether anything else seemed unusual. Mrs. Park said Emmy was still playing, still participating, still herself. She did not want me to overread it. Family changes could make children temporarily more cautious. That explanation made sense. I held on to it. At home, I began watching more carefully. Emmy did not seem frightened. She laughed. She sprawled across the floor while coloring. She negotiated for extra bedtime stories with the same shamelessness as always. But certain small habits had appeared. If she spilled water, she said sorry before reaching for a towel. If I asked what she wanted for dinner, she sometimes asked what I wanted first. Once, she stood beside the refrigerator with her hand on the door and asked if it was okay to get yogurt. She had been getting her own yogurt for almost a year. I told myself not every change needed an explanation. Children absorb rules from school, friends, relatives, television. They experiment with being older. They imitate adults. Still, I started writing dates down, not evidence, not accusations, just notes for myself so I would not later confuse what happened when. The difficulty was that Lauren herself had become harder to speak to separately. Before, she would text about pickup times or ask a quick question about Emmy's preferences. Now I increasingly received replies that sounded as though they had been written by two people. Lauren asked whether Emmy's bedtime could be shifted earlier, for consistency between households. She wanted to know if I could stop sending a particular snack, because Adrian preferred less sugar. She mentioned that Emmy seemed confused about roles and that everyone should use clear language around family. The phrases felt familiar, not because Lauren had used them before, because Adrian had. I tried calling her once after work about Emmy's sleep habits before a longer visit. Lauren answered, but I could hear Adrian moving in the background. I explained that Emmy sometimes woke if she overheated and that leaving the door cracked helped. Lauren started to respond. Then Adrian's voice came faintly from farther away. I could not make out every word, only the tone. Lauren paused. When she continued, the answer had changed. She said they had their own routines and wanted Emmy to learn that different homes could have different expectations. That was true. It was also not what I had asked. I stopped trying to solve their marriage from the other end of a phone call. If Lauren wanted Adrian involved in every decision, that was her choice, unless I had a reason to believe otherwise. I did not yet have one. June remained cautious. When she suggested allowing one of the visits to stretch later into the afternoon, I felt the familiar resistance rise before she had finished speaking. My mind began assembling reasons. Emmy was tired afterward. Her routines mattered. She was becoming overly polite. Adrian had too many rules. Then I heard how it sounded. None of those things, by themselves, justified preventing a longer visit between a child and her biological mother when the visits themselves had been positive. I asked June what she thought. She said she was watching Emmy closely but had not seen anything at that stage that made her recommend stopping contact. She agreed the behavioral changes mattered and should be observed, not ignored. She also reminded me that adjustment could look messy without being dangerous. I could have objected anyway. Instead, I agreed to the longer visit. This time, I was not merely following the path the court had created. I was choosing not to block it before I knew what was actually on the other side. The longer visit took place on a Saturday. When I picked Emmy up, Lauren came out first. Adrian followed carrying Emmy's light jacket. Emmy appeared behind them, talking about a small craft project they had done together. She looked happy. Then she saw me. Her whole face changed in the way it always did when she spotted me after being away. She ran. "Mom!" The word came out bright and automatic. I bent and caught her as she reached me, her arms wrapped around my neck. She smelled like crayons, and the fruity soap Lauren had apparently bought for her bathroom. For half a second, there was no custody case, no court, no Adrian, just Emmy. Then I looked past her shoulder. Lauren's smile had tightened. Not disappeared, just changed. Adrian noticed too. He handed Lauren the jacket. His face remained calm. Emmy had already begun telling me about her afternoon and did not notice the silence behind her. I carried her bag to the car and let her climb into the back seat. While I was fastening the strap around a rolled-up drawing so it would not get crushed, I heard Adrian speak behind me. His voice was low. He was not talking to me. We have to stop rewarding that. I went still. The parking lot sounds became strangely sharp. A cart rattled somewhere near the building. A car door shut 2 rows away. I did not turn immediately. By the time I did, Adrian had stepped closer to Lauren and was saying something else too quietly for me to hear. Lauren looked at him, then at me. Her expression closed. I could have confronted him. Instead, I stored the sentence exactly as I had heard it. We have to stop rewarding that. On the drive home, Emmy hummed to herself and traced a finger along the edge of her drawing. I watched her in the mirror. She seemed fine. I wanted that to mean the sentence was harmless. Maybe Adrian had been talking about something else. Maybe I had missed context. Maybe. That evening, Emmy ate half her dinner, left 3 peas in a perfect line at the edge of her plate, and asked to draw before bed. I was washing dishes when she came back into the kitchen. She did not have paper with her. She stood near the doorway, twisting the hem of her pajama shirt between 2 fingers. I dried my hands. "What is it, sweetheart?" She looked down. Then she asked the question so softly I almost missed the word that mattered. "If I'm good at their house, do I still get to come back here?" The dish towel stopped in my hands. I looked at my 6-year-old daughter standing barefoot on the kitchen tile, waiting for an answer to a question no child should have had reason to ask. And for the first time, Adrian's rules stopped sounding like rules. They sounded like conditions. After Emmy asked whether being good at Lauren's house meant she would still be allowed to come back to mine, I stopped pretending every change in her was ordinary adjustment. I did not call Lauren or turn Adrian's parking lot comment into a family argument. I wrote down Emmy's exact words, the date, and the time, then sat beside her while she drew and resisted forcing the question to prove more than it did. Children misunderstand adult conversations all the time. But Emmy had never asked me whether she was allowed to come home before Lauren returned. I told her the simplest truth I could give a 6-year-old. She did not have to earn her place with me. She nodded, drew smoke coming out of a chimney, and changed the subject to whether squirrels slept in attics. The conversation ended for her. For me, it stayed open. I told June about the question the next morning. She listened without reacting too quickly. That was one of the reasons I had begun trusting her, even when I disliked what she told me. She did not dismiss my concerns, but she also did not turn every uncomfortable sign into proof. She agreed the question was worth noting. She also reminded me that Emmy was moving between households with different rules, different adults, and different expectations for the first time in her life. Children sometimes translated that instability into worries about permanence, even when nobody had explicitly threatened it. I understood the reasoning. I hated the possibility that it might be true because it meant the only responsible thing was to keep watching. Tessa was even more practical. She told me that if I wanted the court to take my concerns seriously later, I needed to be able to distinguish between what frightened me and what actually happened. That became my discipline. I stopped asking myself whether Adrian was dangerous. I asked what he had done. He had placed rules around names. He had spoken about rewarding Emmy's use of mom. Lauren had begun filtering more decisions through him. Emmy was apologizing more. None of those things, by themselves, gave me the power to shut the door. The temporary step-up plan was moving faster than I liked, because every earlier stage had remained uneventful on paper. Then June told me the next step being considered was an overnight visit. I read her message twice before calling. I already knew I did not like it. That was not the same as having grounds to stop it. The visits had continued without an incident anyone outside my head could point to. Emmy was still asking to see Lauren. Lauren had been punctual, cooperative, and appropriate during supervised and extended contact. There were no police reports, no criminal history I knew of, no documented safety issue in the home. Even the behavioral changes Mrs. Park had noticed could still be explained by stress around a major family transition. I asked June whether she thought an overnight was too fast. She said she understood the concern, But based on what she had directly observed at that point, she could not recommend stopping progression entirely. She did support keeping the first overnight limited and reviewing Emmy carefully afterward. I called Tessa. She did not tell me to agree. She told me what disagreement would mean. I could object, and the objection would be heard. But if I based it only on instinct and ambiguous behavior after months of arguing that Emmy needed stability, Lauren's side could frame me as resisting any reunification that became emotionally difficult for me. I knew exactly which paragraph of Lauren's declaration they would use. Rebecca discouraged my attempts to resume parenting. The sentence came back like a threat. For one ugly moment, I resented everyone involved for making me prove I was reasonable while Lauren got to prove only that she was present. Then I remembered the thing I had promised myself after hearing Emmy call her mom. I would not confuse my fear of losing Emmy with Emmy's best interests. So, I did the hardest thing available to me. I did not fight the first overnight. I spent the next 4 days wanting to reverse that decision. Emmy, meanwhile, treated the overnight like a strange combination of adventure and test. On Friday evening, I set a small duffel bag on her bed and told her to choose pajamas, clothes for the next day, her toothbrush, and one thing she wanted to bring for comfort. She packed 2 shirts and no pants, then 5 pairs of socks, then removed 4 of them. I sat on the floor near the closet and let her work it out. Normally, she would have filled the bag with half her bedroom if I let her. That night, she kept setting things aside. Her stuffed fox went into the bag, then came back out. Her favorite book went in, then came out too. I finally asked whether she wanted help. She shook her head. I don't need everything. I looked at the nearly empty bag. You can take more if you want. She glanced around the room. No, I want some stuff to stay here. There was nothing dramatic in the way she said it. That was why it hurt. She picked up the stuffed fox, hugged it once, and placed it back against her pillow. So they know I'm coming back. I did not ask who they were. The toys, the room, me? Maybe she did not know either. I told her the fox would be waiting. She zipped the bag. That night I stood in the hallway looking at the bag and thought about calling Tessa to change my mind. But Emmy had not said she was afraid to go, had not asked me to stop the visit, and had not said Lauren or Adrian had hurt her. Her packing frightened me. It did not yet give me an objective reason to cancel the overnight. I barely slept. The next afternoon, I drove Emmy to Lauren and Adrian's house. It was the first time I had been close enough to really see where they lived. A clean 2-story house in a newer suburban development, small lawn trimmed evenly, driveway clear, flower beds recently mulched. Nothing about it looked threatening. I hated that too. I had wanted the exterior to confirm something. Peeling paint, curtains shut in daylight, a broken screen door. Instead, it looked like the sort of house Diane would point to and say, Lauren had finally settled down. Lauren opened the front door before we reached it. She looked genuinely excited to see Emmy. Adrian came behind her a moment later. Emmy held the duffel by both handles. I kissed the top of her head and reminded her I would pick her up the following morning at the agreed time. She nodded. Then Adrian noticed the bag. He offered to carry it, and Emmy let him. He opened it just inside the doorway, not secretly, almost casually, and said it was easier if everything was organized before they started the evening. I watched from the threshold. He moved the clothes into one neat side of the bag, checked the toothbrush, then lifted a small folded cloth from the bottom. It was an old pillowcase. Emmy sometimes took it when she slept somewhere unfamiliar, because it smelled like the detergent I used at home. She had slipped it into the bag without telling me. Adrian looked at Lauren. Lauren recognized it immediately. Emmy explained that she liked sleeping with it. Adrian smiled. Not cruelly, patiently. He said they already had clean bedding ready in her room, and that part of staying somewhere new was learning to feel comfortable there. Then he handed the pillowcase back to me. It happened so politely that objecting would have made me look absurd. I looked at Lauren. She did not tell him to put it back. Emmy looked at me too. I wanted to tuck the pillowcase into her pocket. Instead, I folded it once and held it against my palm. "Tomorrow morning?" I reminded her. She nodded. I left. The drive home took less than 20 minutes. It felt much longer. Every instinct in me rebelled against entering an empty house, while Emmy slept under somebody else's roof. Without cartoons, running feet, or questions shouted from another room, every room seemed larger. I put the pillowcase on her bed, caught myself smoothing the blanket as though she might arrive any minute, and ate half my dinner standing at the kitchen counter. At 8, Lauren sent the update we had agreed on. Emmy had eaten, played, brushed her teeth, and was getting ready for bed. There was even a picture of the yellow room. Emmy sat cross-legged on the bed holding one of her drawings. She looked fine, happy even. I hated myself for studying the background. The room looked exactly like Emmy had described it. Pale curtains, low shelf, a few stuffed animals, a row of picture books, a place prepared for a child. I set the phone down. At 9:15, I picked it up again. No new message. At 10, I almost texted. I did not. At 11:30, I finally turned off the light. Sleep came in pieces. I woke at 2:14 because I thought I had heard Emmy call me. The house was silent. I lay there staring at the ceiling until nearly 3. That was the night I learned how strange motherhood could be when you had no task to perform. No fever to treat, no lunch to pack, no nightmare to soothe. Only the knowledge that your child existed somewhere beyond your reach, and that everyone around you expected you to prove love by tolerating it. The next morning I arrived, 6 minutes early. I made myself wait in the car until the agreed time. When the door opened, Emmy came out already wearing her backpack, even though she did not need it. Lauren followed. Adrian remained inside. I watched Emmy walk toward me. Not run, walk. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the bruise. Small, purple-blue, just above her elbow. I saw it when she lifted her arm to pull open the back door. My stomach tightened so quickly it almost hurt. I did not grab her arm. I did not demand an explanation. I helped her into the car, then looked at Lauren. Lauren had already seen where my eyes went. She explained before I asked that Emmy had bumped into the edge of a side table while playing the night before. I looked back at Emmy. "She was playing," Emmy said quickly. I hit the table. The wording was not strange. The speed was. She spoke like someone reciting the answer to a question she knew was coming. I thanked Lauren for the information and drove away. For the first 5 minutes, I did not ask anything about the bruise. Emmy talked about pancakes. Then the board game. Then how the yellow curtains looked orange when the morning sun came through them. She did not sound frightened. At home, she changed into shorts and spent an hour building a cardboard town on the living room rug. I watched her use scissors, argue with tape, sing to herself. The bruise existed beside all of that. A child could bump into a table, and a child could repeat an explanation quickly because adults had already asked about it. I wrote down the date, and nothing more. Monday, Mrs. Park stopped me at pickup. Emmy had been tired. Not dangerously so, just slower than usual. She had also refused to remove her light sweater during an indoor activity, even after the room warmed up. Mrs. Park offered no theory. Neither did I. But another detail joined the others. That evening, Diane came by with groceries. She insisted she had bought too much of, which was her preferred method of helping, without calling it help. Emmy was coloring at the table when she knocked a box of crayons onto the floor. They scattered everywhere. Before I could move, Emmy said sorry. Once. Then again. Then a third time, when Diane bent to help pick them up. Mom stopped. She looked at me over Emmy's head. I saw the moment something inside her shifted. Later, after Emmy was in the bath, Mom asked whether she had always apologized like that. I said no. For the first time since Lauren returned, Diane did not tell me to be patient with my sister. She asked what June thought. That mattered more than any apology would have. I told her June was watching the changes, but that nothing so far established what caused them. Mom nodded. She looked older in that moment, not because anything had physically changed, but because hope had stopped carrying all the weight in her face. A few days later, Lauren called me directly. Adrian was not on the line. At first, she asked about Emmy's sleep after the overnight. Then she circled strangely toward behavior. She wanted to know whether Emmy had always become emotional when rules changed. The question sharpened my attention immediately. I asked what she meant. Lauren said nothing major had happened. Emmy had become upset a few times when reminded of routines and expectations, and Lauren wondered whether that was typical. I asked what kinds of routines. There was a pause. Then I heard a door close somewhere near her. Lauren's voice changed. She told me she was probably overthinking things, and that Emmy had done fine. I asked whether Adrian was there. Before she answered, I heard his voice in the background. Not the words, just him. Lauren ended the call soon afterward. I stood in my kitchen staring at the dark phone screen. The conversation bothered me for reasons I could not yet name, not because Lauren had accused Emmy of anything, because she had sounded as though she were testing a version of events before deciding whether to say it out loud. I added the call to my notes. The first overnight was reviewed. No formal complaint had been made. No one had observed a safety incident. The bruise had an explanation that was possible. Emmy herself had repeated it. She still said she wanted to see Lauren. I raised every concern I had. June did not dismiss them, but she still could not recommend stopping the next overnight on a small bruise, ambiguous behavior changes, and my interpretation of conversations. Tessa warned that refusing without something more concrete would feed Lauren's existing claim that I obstructed reunification whenever it advanced. I hated the bind, but the second overnight stayed on the schedule. It fell almost exactly 4 weeks after Lauren had appeared in Mom's backyard. That detail would matter to me later, because I could measure the collapse of our old life in days. 28 days from, "It's time you came home with me," to the photograph. On the afternoon of the second overnight, Emmy packed differently. No 5 pairs of socks this time. No indecision over the stuffed fox. She moved quickly, choosing exactly what she thought she needed. That should have reassured me. Instead, it felt practiced. Before we left, she checked the bag twice. Then she asked whether the pillowcase should stay home. I said she could take it if she wanted. She looked toward the bag, then shook her head. "I don't need it." The words sounded too familiar. I did not argue. At the house, Adrian did not check the bag in front of me this time. Lauren hugged Emmy. Emmy let her. I told her when I would be back. She nodded without asking any questions. I watched the door close. That evening, I tried to work from home. I answered emails. I did not absorb. I reorganized a drawer that did not need reorganizing. At 9, I received the usual short update from Lauren saying Emmy was in bed. No photograph this time. I stared at the message. Something in me wanted proof of her face. I did not ask. At 10:43, my phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. For one stupid second, I assumed it was spam. Then I saw the image preview. I opened it. The room around me disappeared. Emmy was standing with her back partly turned toward the camera, wearing a sleeveless undershirt. The image showed bruising along one upper arm and several darker marks across the upper part of her back. Nothing graphic, nothing I could mistake for one careless collision with a table. My first sensation was cold. Not fear, not rage, cold. It spread from the center of my chest into both arms. Then my body caught up. I was on my feet before I remembered standing. My keys were in the bowl beside the door. I grabbed them. For 3 steps, There was no thought in my mind except one: get Emmy. Then I stopped. The keys dug into my palm. I looked again at the photograph. I did not know who had taken it. I did not know when. I did not know whether Adrian knew it had been sent. And I suddenly understood that charging into that house could give him exactly what he needed: an angry guardian violating the process, making accusations before anyone independent had seen the evidence. I could get Emmy out for one night, and still lose the ability to protect her afterward. My thumb shook as I opened my contacts. I called Tessa, and while the phone rang, I kept staring at the bruises on the little girl I had spent 4 weeks trying so hard not to love selfishly. Tessa answered on the 4th ring. I did not explain the entire history. I did not tell her what Adrian had said in the parking lot, or how Emmy had packed too lightly, or how Lauren's voice had changed when Adrian walked into a room. I told her only what mattered in that moment. Emmy was at Lauren's house. I had just received a photograph from an unknown number. The photograph showed multiple bruises on Emmy's arm and upper back. I did not know who took it. I did not know whether the picture had been taken that night, and I was standing by my front door with my car keys in my hand. There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to hear my own breathing. Then Tessa gave me the sentence I would remember, long after I stopped remembering the exact sequence of calls that followed. Protecting her isn't about doing the fastest thing. It's about doing the thing no one can undo tomorrow. I closed my fist around the keys. Every part of me wanted to reject that. Fast was simple. Fast meant 20 minutes down the road, pounding on Lauren's door, putting Emmy behind me, and daring somebody to stop me. But Tessa made me think one day past my panic. If Adrian closed the door, if Lauren refused to release her, if police arrived and saw a guardian violating a court-approved overnight arrangement while screaming accusations nobody had yet independently verified. If Adrian turned my desperation into the story Lauren had already placed on paper, that I would sabotage reunification whenever I felt threatened. I could make myself feel like Emmy's mother for one night, and still damage the very protection I needed to keep her safe after mourning. That understanding did not calm me. It gave the fear somewhere to go. Tessa had me make the emergency report immediately while she stayed available. She did not become the gatekeeper between me and Emmy's safety. Her role was narrower, and, in that moment, more useful. She kept me from doing something irreversible while the protective process started moving. I gave the photograph, the address, the overnight schedule, and the fact that Emmy was there at that moment. I repeated the unknown number twice. The person taking the report asked questions I hated because they sounded slow while Emmy existed somewhere beyond my reach. The report required facts I hated having to separate, while Emmy was still in that house. I did not know when the image had been taken or who caused the injuries. I did know about the earlier bruise, the explanation Lauren had given, the changes Mrs. Park had noticed, and Emmy's questions about being good enough to come home. I gave each piece without turning it into a conclusion. The facts sounded smaller when separated. That was the terrible thing. A child could bruise herself. A child could become clingy during custody changes. A child could apologize too much. A strict adult could dislike being interrupted. A biological mother could want structure. One small fact at a time. There was always somewhere to hide. But I was no longer looking at them, one at a time. By the time I finished the report, the keys had left marks in my palm. I put them down. That was one of the hardest things I had ever done. Not driving. Staying where I was while other people began doing the work that I wanted to do with my own hands. I paced between the kitchen and the front window until I noticed I was doing it, then forced myself into a chair. The photograph remained open on my phone. I stopped looking at it, not because the image became less important, because every time I looked, my body forgot the plan. I had to keep reminding myself that I knew almost nothing about what happened beyond what the picture showed. I knew Emmy was bruised. I knew somebody inside that house had photographed it. I knew somebody had chosen to send it to me. I did not know who. I did not know why. And I did not know whether the person who sent it was trying to save Emmy, warn me, punish someone else, or create chaos. That uncertainty frightened me almost as much as the bruises. A welfare response was initiated that night. I will not pretend those next hours felt efficient, just because a process existed. To me, everything moved through molasses. I was told not to contact Adrian or Lauren in a way that might interfere with the immediate assessment. So I didn't. I hated every minute of that decision. My phone sat on the kitchen table while I stared at it, as if restraint itself could ring. When Lauren finally called, it was not the frightened voice I expected. She sounded controlled. Not calm exactly. Too careful for calm. She said someone had come to the house because of a report concerning Emmy's injuries. She told me Emmy was fine and accused me, indirectly at first, of overreacting to something that had happened while Emmy was playing. I did not tell her I had the photograph. That detail had not yet been released through me. I asked only whether Emmy was safe. Lauren said yes. I asked whether she had seen bruises on Emmy. There was a pause. Then she said Emmy had been active that day and had taken a couple of tumbles. A couple. The phrase stuck. Not one side table anymore. Before I could ask anything else, Adrian's voice appeared closer to the phone. Lauren stopped speaking. He took over without formally taking over, the way he always did. I could hear him near her, feeding steadiness into the conversation. He said they were cooperating fully and that he hoped this would finally demonstrate how aggressively I was trying to interfere with the reunification process. The statement was polished enough to sound prepared. I felt anger rise so sharply that I almost answered in kind. Instead, I remembered Tessa's warning. I told them I would cooperate with whatever independent review was required, and ended the call. That was all. No accusation, no speech, no threat. I sat there afterward shaking so hard I had to press both palms flat against the table. Adrian had done exactly what I feared. He had not argued about Emmy. He had argued about me. That difference mattered. If he could make the story about my jealousy, my possessiveness, my resistance to Lauren, then the bruises became background. I could not let him choose the frame. The next morning blurred into pieces. I slept perhaps an hour. Emmy was seen and her injuries documented through the appropriate process, without turning her into a spectacle. I was not given every detail immediately, nor should I have been. What I learned was enough. The pattern of marks deserved investigation, and a single accidental bump did not neatly explain everything that had been observed. That still did not tell anyone who caused them. I kept reminding myself of that. Wanting Adrian to be responsible because I distrusted him was not the same thing as proving it. Wanting Lauren to be innocent because she was my sister was not evidence either. June became involved early that morning. Her voice sounded different from the conversations we had before. Not alarmist. Focused. The overnight arrangement was paused while the concern was reviewed. That was the first piece of news that allowed me to breathe all the way into my lungs. Emmy would come back to me. For the moment. The phrase mattered. Nobody promised forever. Nobody even promised what the next review would decide. But she was coming home. I drove to the agreed pickup point with both hands tight on the steering wheel. I had imagined that moment too many times overnight. In every version, Emmy ran to me. In some, she cried. In one particularly cruel version my mind kept replaying. She whispered that she wanted to go home, and I told her she already was. None of those things happened. When Emmy came through the doorway, she was holding June's hand. Her face looked pale with tiredness. She saw me immediately. She did not run. She came forward slowly and stopped close enough for me to touch her. I knelt. The urge to pull her into my arms was almost painful. I did not. I let her decide. After several seconds, she leaned into me. Not dramatically. just enough for her forehead to rest against my shoulder. I wanted to ask where every bruise came from and whether Adrian had touched her, but the first question Emmy asked was whether Lauren was in trouble. I told her the adults were figuring things out and that none of it was her responsibility. She repeated that she had fallen. I did not challenge her. After 6 years of teaching Emmy to tell me when she hurt, the harder job was making sure I did not shape the answer I wanted. On the drive home, she watched houses pass in silence. She asked whether Lauren knew where she was and whether Adrian was mad. I answered only what I knew. The relief on her face, when I admitted I did not know everything, reminded me that she did not need a perfect explanation. She needed information she could trust. That morning she barely spoke. When we turned onto our street, she asked if Lauren knew where she was. I said yes. Then she asked whether Adrian was mad. I told her I did not know. She nodded. There was something about the relief on her face when I admitted ignorance that struck me. She did not want me to solve everything. She wanted information she could trust. At home, she stood inside the doorway without taking off her shoes. For several seconds, she looked around as though checking whether anything had changed. Nothing had. The stuffed fox remained on her bed. Her drawing of the purple-roofed house still hung on the wall. The cereal bowl she had used 2 mornings earlier was in the dishwasher. Her world had stayed still while she had been gone. I wanted to tell her that. I wanted to promise nothing would ever move again. But I had learned enough by then to know that promises children cannot verify are sometimes more for adults than for them. So I told her lunch would be ready in 20 minutes and that her yellow cup was where it always was. She took off her shoes. That was enough. The rest of the day moved in strangely ordinary pieces. Emmy ate half a grilled cheese sandwich. She watched a cartoon. She refused a bath but accepted a warm washcloth. She changed into loose pajamas without asking for help. I noticed her trying to keep her back turned from me while changing. I noticed. I did not force her to turn around. Later she drew at the table, but did not draw a house. She covered a page with circles instead. For the rest of the day, I kept catching myself watching too closely. Every quiet moment pulled my attention, and every vibration of my phone made Emmy look up. I began learning the difference between noticing a child and making a child feel observed. She needed me present without turning every movement into another question. That was new. She sat on the floor and helped Emmy sort crayons by color because Emmy insisted the blues had been mixed up. Mom stayed less than an hour. Before leaving, she hugged me in the hallway where Emmy could not see. No speech, no apology for having pushed me to give Lauren a chance. Just a grip around my shoulders that lasted several seconds longer than usual. When she left, I felt less alone. Not safer, just less alone. Tessa called in the evening and reminded me to keep documenting without editorializing. Dates. Observed behavior. Statements exactly as spoken. No conclusions in my notes. I understood why. Adrian had already begun trying to convert this into a dispute over my motives. The only thing stronger than his interpretation would be facts that did not require mine. So I built a chronology. Not a secret file, not some dramatic stack of evidence I planned to slam down in front of a judge. Just the ordinary record of what had happened. The first time Emmy asked whether being good meant she could come home. Mrs. Park's comments. The first bruise. Lauren's explanation. Lauren's later question about Emmy becoming dramatic around rules. The second overnight. The photograph. Each item looked small on its own. Together they formed something I could no longer dismiss. The photograph remained the largest unanswered question. I checked the unknown number again. I did not call it. I did not send a message. The temptation was constant. Who are you? Why did you send this? What happened? But if the sender had taken a risk to get the image out, I did not know what contacting them might expose. I let the number sit. That restraint became its own kind of work. The next day, June stopped by, as part of the ongoing review. She spent time with Emmy while I stayed close enough to be available, but not close enough to influence what was said. I hated the physical arrangement. Hearing pieces of your child's voice through a partly closed door while deliberately not listening is a specific kind of torture. I washed the same mug twice. When June came out, she did not give me a transcript. She told me only what I needed to know. Emmy was still minimizing the injuries. She repeated that she had fallen. She also seemed unusually concerned about what would happen to Lauren if adults believed something bad had happened. June told me not to pressure her. I said I wouldn't. Then she looked at me in the way people do when they know agreement is easier than restraint. I meant it. Mostly. That night, Emmy crawled into my bed just after midnight. She had not done that in months. She did not say she had a nightmare. She climbed under the blanket, turned her back to me, and curled into the space beside my ribs. I lay awake, listening to her breathing. I could see one faint bruise near her upper arm where her pajama sleeve had shifted. The photograph flashed through my mind. I wanted to ask who had taken it. The question felt almost harmless. It was only one fact, one name, one answer. I kept my mouth closed. At some point, she reached backward in her sleep until her fingers found the edge of my shirt. I did not move for nearly an hour. The following morning, Mrs. Park called me before school. Emmy was staying home that day. But Mrs. Park had gone back through her own observations after hearing that the reunification schedule had been paused. She wanted to make sure June knew that Emmy's behavior had changed specifically after the overnight visits began. She mentioned the repeated permission-seeking again, the apologizing, the sweater she would not remove. Then she remembered something else. A phrase Emmy had used earlier that week after another child knocked over a container of pencils. The other child had started to cry. Emmy had crouched beside her and told her not to worry because good girls don't make family problems. Mrs. Park had assumed she was repeating something from home or television. Now she was not so sure. The phrase sat in my mind long after the call ended. Good girls don't make family problems. I had never said it. Diane had never said it. I could not imagine Mrs. Park saying it. Still, I refused to decide who had. That was the discipline I was learning. Facts first, meaning later. By afternoon, Emmy seemed restless. She followed me from room to room without admitting she was following me. If I folded laundry, she colored nearby. If I moved to the kitchen, she brought the coloring book with her. Finally, while I was slicing an apple, she asked whether Lauren could still call her. I told her that would depend on what the adults working on the situation decided, but that nobody expected Emmy to stop caring about Lauren. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Then came the sentence that told me how wrong I had been about what she needed from me. I didn't mean to make her get in trouble. I put the knife down. You didn't. She rubbed the edge of the counter with one thumb. I fell. Again. Same answer. Same flat certainty. I crouched so we were closer to eye level. I wanted to tell her I believed her. I wanted to tell her I didn't. Both options felt like traps. So, I told her she did not have to fix anything for the adults. She looked unconvinced. After a moment, she asked for the apple slices. I gave them to her. The conversation ended. The fear did not. That evening, June called to confirm that the overnight pause would remain in place while the concerns were reviewed. I should have felt victory. Instead, I felt suspended. Emmy was home. Adrian could not simply expect another overnight the following weekend. But the story was not solved. No one had yet identified who caused the injuries. The photograph still came from an unknown number. Lauren was still insisting the marks came from ordinary play. Adrian was still framing me as the problem. And Emmy was acting as if protecting Lauren mattered more than explaining what had happened to her. I sat beside her on the couch while she watched an animated movie she had seen enough times to quote from memory. Halfway through, she leaned against my arm. I did not move. During the credits, She asked why June had wanted to talk to her again. I told her adults sometimes needed help understanding whether children felt safe. She looked toward the television. Then she asked whether somebody had told June about her bruises. I said yes. She twisted one strand of hair around her finger. I knew I had to be careful. I told her that someone had helped the adults understand there were marks they needed to look at. That was all. I did not say unknown number. I did not say photograph. I did not say who sent it. Emmy turned toward me so quickly that the strand of hair slipped from her fingers. Her face changed. Not confusion. Recognition. You got the picture? Everything inside me went still. I had never told her there was a picture. I had never shown it to her. I had never said someone photographed her. But Emmy knew. I watched her eyes drop immediately to her lap. I did not ask who took it. Not yet. Because in that instant, a worse question had already taken its place. Someone inside Lauren's house had seen enough to photograph those bruises. Someone had shown enough concern to preserve what happened. And then that person had still left my 6-year-old there. The worst thing about Emmy knowing the photograph existed was not that it gave me a new clue. It was that it gave her another thing to be afraid of. The moment the words left her mouth, "You got the picture?" She folded inward so quickly. I could almost see the decision happening. Her shoulders rose. Her eyes dropped to her hands. One finger began rubbing the seam of her pajama pants. I wanted to ask who had taken the photograph, whether Lauren had seen the bruises, and what Emmy had been told about it. Instead, I lowered the television and told her she was not in trouble. The next morning, I gave June Emmy's exact words and nothing more. June warned me not to fill in the blanks with leading questions. A frightened child who sensed competing adults could begin answering the adults instead of answering from memory. That instruction went against 6 years of habit. My relationship with Emmy had always been built on, "Tell me what happened. Tell me where it hurts. Tell me what you need." Now, I had to make breakfast, find the socks without the seam she hated, drive her to school, and let ordinary routine do work that questions could not. Instead, I told her breakfast was ready. I found the socks without the seam she hated. I drove her to school and let Mrs. Park know only what she needed to know about the temporary pause in visits and the ongoing review. That ordinary rhythm became the only thing I could give Emmy without conditions. She clung to it more than I expected. For the first few mornings after coming home, she checked the schedule repeatedly. Who would pick her up? Would I be there after school? Was Grandma Diane coming over? Did she have to go anywhere after dinner? The questions were simple. I answered them simply. I did not promise next month. I promised 4 o'clock. I promised dinner. I promised bedtime. I was learning that frightened children sometimes trusted clocks more easily than forever. At school, Mrs. Park kept watching without hovering. She sent me brief updates through the normal channels, rather than turning Emmy into a special case in front of her classmates. Emmy was still participating. She still drew. She still laughed. But her attention shifted whenever adults used certain phrases about behavior. One afternoon, Mrs. Park told June about a minor classroom incident. A boy had knocked over a box of markers. Before the teacher could respond, Emmy hurried over and began picking them up for him. The boy was crying because he thought he was in trouble. Emmy whispered something Mrs. Park had already heard once before. "Good girls don't make family problems." June repeated the sentence to me later. I wrote it down, not because I thought it proved anything by itself, because I knew the phrase had not come from my house. It was too polished to be Emmy's own invention, and too adult in its moral shape, even if the words themselves were simple. Still, I did not ask her where she heard it. The restraint began to feel like an ache in my body. 3 days later, Emmy finally gave me the opposite of what I wanted. We were in the kitchen after school. She was peeling the paper sleeve off a yogurt cup in tiny strips, concentrating as if the task required both hands and all of her attention. I told her June might want to talk with her again. The spoon stopped. Her eyes stayed on the yogurt. Then she said she had already told everyone what happened. She fell. I said I understood. That should have been enough. Instead, something in my face must have betrayed me. Emmy looked up. You don't believe me? It was not quite a question. I sat across from her. I told her I believed that she was telling me what she wanted me to know. That answer was probably more complicated than she needed, but it was the safest truth I could find. She pushed the yogurt away. Then she said the thing I had secretly feared since the supervised visits began. You just don't want me to have another mom. The words were quiet. The accusation hurt because a small part of it was true. I had been jealous when Emmy first reached for Lauren, and had briefly wanted Lauren to fail enough to prove my fear justified. Emmy did not know those private thoughts, but she could feel tension. I could have defended myself by listing 6 years of school mornings, fevers, and bedtime routines. Instead, I told her she was allowed to care about Lauren. She still worried that Lauren would be sad if the adults believed something bad had happened. Sitting alone in my car later, I understood the new maternal test. I had to protect Emmy without requiring her to agree with me, thank me, or choose me while I did it. She spent some time with me first. I told her about Emmy's accusation and the way she kept worrying more about Lauren's consequences than her own injuries. June listened. June gave the pattern a name without turning it into a diagnosis. Children don't always tell us they're afraid. Sometimes they just become very good at not causing trouble. I had expected fear to look like tears or refusal. Emmy had become easier, more apologetic, more careful, more concerned with adult peace. That was what made the sentence stay with me. That frightened me more. June did not diagnose Emmy from a handful of behaviors. She was careful about that. She simply told me that excessive compliance could matter, especially when it emerged during a major change in environment and alongside physical concerns. Then she spoke with Emmy. I stayed in the laundry room because it was the farthest place in the house from where they sat without making me look as though I were fleeing. I sorted towels that were already folded. At one point, I heard Emmy laugh. The sound gave me a strange kind of hope. A child could still laugh and still be carrying something heavy. That was another assumption I had to let go of. Afterward, June gave me only what she was allowed and what I needed to know. Emmy remained guarded. She did not describe anyone hitting her. She continued to say she had fallen. But when June talked generally about adults getting angry, Emmy became anxious about Lauren getting in trouble. That pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Later that afternoon, while Emmy was at Diane's for a short visit, I sat with June and went back over the timeline. Not to hunt for a culprit, to understand the sequence. The first changes in Emmy's behavior appeared after visits began expanding. The language about proper names and family roles came after Adrian became more present. Then excessive permission-seeking. Then the first overnight. Then the bruise. Then Lauren's strange phone call, asking whether Emmy became dramatic when rules changed. Then the second overnight. Then the photograph. Then Emmy's immediate concern that Lauren would get in trouble. Nothing there proved what happened in the house. But the sequence had a shape now. It was no longer a pile of unrelated worries. I asked June what frightened children sometimes feared most in situations involving adults they loved. She did not generalize Emmy for me. She said children could sometimes become responsible for preserving the family around them, especially if they believed conflict happened because of something they said or did. That idea stayed with me. Emmy had been abandoned once before she was old enough to remember it. I had always assumed that meant the abandonment could not live inside her in any meaningful way. But she had grown up knowing the outline. Lauren left. Rebecca stayed. Even the softened version told her that mothers could disappear. Now Lauren had returned. If Emmy believed telling the truth might make Lauren lose Adrian, lose her house, lose the life she had built, then speaking might feel less like asking for help and more like destroying her mother's second chance. And if Lauren's life collapsed because of Emmy, what would stop Lauren from leaving again? For the first time, Emmy's silence stopped looking like loyalty alone. It looked like fear of abandonment, wearing loyalty's clothes. I did not tell Emmy I had figured that out. Understanding why a child was silent did not give me permission to tear the silence open. I had to let her come towards safety, at the speed she could manage. That became harder when Lauren asked to see her. Because overnight visits were paused, contact now had to be handled more cautiously. There was a controlled interaction several days later, with June involved and clear limits around what could be discussed. I hated agreeing to it. Emmy wanted to go. That mattered. She did not bounce with excitement the way she had before. But when I asked whether she wanted the visit, she nodded. I reminded myself again. Protecting her did not mean using fear to make every decision for her. The meeting took place in one of the same neutral rooms used earlier in reunification. I was not present for the entire interaction, but there was a short transition afterward when Lauren and I were both in the room, while Emmy gathered her things. Lauren looked exhausted. Not dramatically broken, just diminished. She had lost some of the polish she carried into Mom's backyard. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes. Her hair was pulled back without much effort. For one moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then she looked at Emmy's arm. The bruising had faded considerably by then. Lauren asked me what the doctor, or rather, the clinician who had documented the injuries had said about the marks near Emmy's shoulder. My attention sharpened. I did not answer immediately. The marks near her shoulder. I had never told Lauren where the photograph showed bruising. The official response had not come through me in that level of detail. I had not discussed the specific locations with her on the phone. I knew because I had been careful. Very careful. I watched Lauren's face. She realized something had changed in mine. Her hand tightened around the strap of her purse. I asked how she knew there were marks near Emmy's shoulder. The pause was short, not long enough to be dramatic. Long enough, Lauren said she assumed. Then Adrian appeared at the doorway. He was not supposed to enter the child-focused interaction without coordination, and he stayed outside the room, but his presence changed Lauren instantly. Her shoulders drew back, her expression flattened. She told me she did not want another argument. I did not give her one. Emmy came toward me with her drawing tucked under her arm. We left. In the car, I did not ask Emmy anything about the visit. I barely heard her describe the drawing. My mind was somewhere else, near the shoulder. Lauren knew. Maybe she had seen the photograph before it was sent. Maybe she had seen the bruises directly. Either possibility mattered. That evening, after Emmy went to bed, I pulled out the notes I had been keeping. I found the date of Lauren's phone call after the first overnight. The question about Emmy becoming dramatic when rules changed. At the time, I had read it as concern about adjustment. Now I read it differently. Lauren had asked the question before the photograph, before the second overnight, before the marks on Emmy's upper back had been sent to me. I went farther back. The first small bruise appeared after the first overnight. Lauren explained it immediately. Then came her private question about rules. Then her voice changed when Adrian entered. The sequence tightened around me. I did not need to become a detective to see what it suggested. Lauren had been noticing something, maybe not everything, but something, and she had not told me. The next piece came from Emmy, although she did not know she was giving it. 2 nights later, she woke after midnight and came to the kitchen for water. I found her sitting at the table instead, both hands wrapped around the cup. She was half asleep. That made her less guarded. I sat beside her. We said nothing for a while. Then she asked whether Lauren and Adrian were still together. I said, as far as I knew, yes. Her shoulders loosened. That reaction told me more than the answer. I asked no question. Emmy stared into the water. After a long silence, she whispered that Adrian got mad when Lauren was not on his side. Child's words, simple, No accusation of violence. No legal language. I asked what she meant by side. Emmy shrugged and immediately retreated. She said she did not know. Then, after another long silence, she said Lauren got sad when people argued because of her, because of Emmy. I felt something inside me sink. I told her grown-up arguments were never her job to prevent. She did not answer. She finished the water and went back to bed. I sat alone at the table. The picture was becoming clearer without becoming easier. Emmy was not simply afraid of Adrian. She was afraid of what happened to Lauren when Adrian became angry. And more than that, she believed she had the power to cause it. A 6-year-old had somehow become responsible for the stability of a marriage she had been dragged into less than a month earlier. Emmy's silence made more sense then. If telling the truth caused Lauren and Adrian to fight, Emmy could believe she had damaged Lauren's new life and risked being left again. A 6-year-old did not need the language of abandonment to organize herself around the fear of it. I thought of Lauren asking whether Emmy was dramatic around rules. I thought of her knowing about the bruise near the shoulder. I thought of how quickly she changed when Adrian entered her room. And for the first time, the question that had driven me since the photograph changed again. I had been asking who hurt Emmy. Now I had another question. How long had Lauren known Emmy was not safe? I went to my notes and placed the dates side by side. The first overnight. The first bruise. Lauren's private question about rules. The second overnight. The photograph. The truth was sitting there in the spacing between them. Lauren had noticed something was wrong before that picture was ever sent. She had time. Time to stop the next overnight. Time to say something. Time to choose Emmy before the bruises became impossible to ignore. And she didn't. Once I understood that Lauren had noticed something was wrong before the photograph ever reached me, I stopped waiting for another accidental clue. I did not confront her at the next handoff. I did not send a message demanding answers. I did not tell Diane what I suspected, because suspicion had already cost enough in this story, and I had no intention of turning mine into another family argument Emmy could somehow feel responsible for. I waited. That was becoming a skill I hated. 3 days passed. Emmy went to school. I went to work. June checked in. Tessa reminded me that the overnight pause remained in place and that the review was still moving through its ordinary channels. Adrian continued presenting himself as cooperative and offended. Lauren barely communicated except through the approved arrangements. Then, on Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was standing beside the copier. The message was from Lauren, not through the usual thread, not through Adrian. Just 4 words. Can we talk alone? I read them twice. The copier behind me continued spitting out architectural plans nobody seemed to be waiting for. I did not answer immediately. The fact that she was asking to speak without Adrian mattered before she said anything else. We agreed to meet the following morning in a coffee shop across town, early enough that Emmy would already be at school and I would still make it to work. I chose the place because it was public, and because I knew Adrian did not frequent that area. I did not tell Lauren that was why. When I arrived, she was already sitting in the far corner with both hands wrapped around a paper cup she had not touched. She looked worse than she had during the controlled visit. Not injured, not visibly frightened, just worn thin. Her clothes were neat, but her face had the strained emptiness of somebody who had been sleeping badly for too long. She kept checking the entrance without seeming to know she was doing it. I sat across from her. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Years earlier, when Lauren had first left Emmy with me, silence between us still carried the possibility of sisterhood. I could remember sitting in my apartment while she cried from exhaustion, both of us too young in different ways. Both pretending the situation was temporary, because temporary was easier to bear. That morning, the silence felt like evidence. Lauren finally asked whether Emmy was okay. I told her she was home. That was not the answer Lauren wanted, and we both knew it. She asked about the bruises. I watched her face. I said the marks had been documented, and the overnight contact remained paused. She nodded as though I had confirmed something she already knew. I did not ask how. I wanted her to step into the truth without me pulling her. For once, Lauren had to carry her own sentence all the way to the end. She stared at the cardboard sleeve around her cup. Then she said Adrian did not know she was there. The words landed quietly. I did not respond. Lauren went on in fragments at first. Adrian had become suspicious of every call that did not happen in front of him. He checked where she went. He asked who she texted. She kept insisting this was temporary because of the case, because everything was stressful, because any husband might become more protective when his family was being attacked. She used his language, even while describing what it had done to her. I noticed that, but I did not interrupt to diagnose her marriage. That was not why I was there. I asked one question. Why did you come back for Emmy? Lauren's eyes lifted. For a moment, I saw the same expression she used when we were teenagers, and Mom caught her in a lie she had not finished building yet. Not fear exactly. Calculation. Then she looked down again. The first version she gave me was almost identical to the one in the court filing. She had grown up. She was stable. She regretted the years she missed. She wanted to repair her relationship with her daughter. All of that could have been true. None of it explained the timing. I reminded her she had gone nearly 6 years without filing anything. 6 years without showing up at my door. 6 years, during which I had not hidden Emmy. Why now? Lauren's fingers tightened around the cup. Then she finally told me the part I had been missing. When she first met Adrian, she had told him about Emmy. But not the truth. Not really. She told him she had gone through a difficult period after giving birth, and that I stepped in temporarily. She said the arrangement became complicated, that I became attached, that I used the guardianship to keep Emmy with me while Lauren tried to rebuild her life. She had not told him she stopped calling. She had not told him how often I asked her to come back. She had not told him that the longer she stayed away, the easier staying away became. In Lauren's version, she had lost control of the situation. In reality, she had given it away. I sat very still while Lauren spoke. The anger came in layers. The declaration I had read at work was not merely a strategy invented for court. Lauren had been living inside that version of the past long before she filed it. She had built a marriage around the claim that circumstance and my interference had separated her from Emmy, because admitting that she had chosen not to return would have changed the woman Adrian believed he married. Adrian heard enough to start asking questions. Then he asked more. Dates, visits. Why Lauren had no recent pictures except the ones Diane occasionally sent. Why she had never filed to change the guardianship if she truly believed I was keeping her child. Lauren tried to maintain the old story. The more she explained, the less it held together. Adrian did not respond with sympathy. He responded with a demand. If Lauren had really been wronged, he told her, then she needed to fix it. She needed to act like Emmy's mother. She needed to bring her daughter home. I thought back to Mom's backyard. Adrian standing several steps behind Lauren. His language about making things right. His composure. His certainty. At the time, I had assumed the phrase referred to Lauren's regret. Now it meant something else. It meant completing the story she had sold him. If Lauren had been prevented from raising Emmy, then reclaiming her proved Lauren had been telling the truth. If Lauren did nothing, the alternative became harder to hide. Lauren insisted that once the visits began, wanting Emmy had become real. I believed her. That was what made the truth harder rather than easier. She could feel genuine love for Emmy and still use reclaiming her to protect the story she had told Adrian. Feeling something for a child and choosing that child were not the same act. Lauren did not answer directly. She said he believed children needed clear roles, clear homes, clear authority. The words were painfully familiar. Structure, respect, family unity. All those tidy words that had arrived before the bruises. I thought of Emmy asking whether being good meant she could still come home. I kept my voice level. Did he want her to call you Mom? Lauren stared at the table. He wanted things to feel normal. Normal. That word almost made me laugh. Instead, I asked what happened when Emmy called me Mom in front of him. Lauren's face changed. The answer was there before she gave it. Adrian did not like it. At first, he corrected only Lauren after visits. He said she was letting Emmy stay confused. Then he began correcting Emmy more directly, framing it as respect. If she called me Mom in their house, he reminded her that she was with her real family now. Lauren said she told him not to push too hard, not stop, not do not say that, just not too hard. The distinction cut. I remembered his sentence from the parking lot. We have to stop rewarding that. At the time, it was the first thing he said that stripped the politeness away. Now I understood what had been happening around it. Emmy's affection had become behavior to manage. I asked Lauren when she first knew Adrian's rules were not simply strict. She went silent. That was the question she had been avoiding since she sent the message asking to meet. I waited. Her eyes moved toward the entrance again. Then she told me about the first overnight. After I left, Emmy asked for the pillowcase Adrian had handed back to me. Lauren said she tried to distract her. Adrian said no. He told Emmy the point of the overnight was to learn she could sleep there without needing symbols of the other house. That phrase made my stomach turn. The other house. My home reduced to a competing symbol. Lauren said Emmy became upset. Not hysterical. Just tearful. She kept asking whether I knew the pillowcase had stayed with me. Adrian told her crying would not change the rule. Lauren said she thought he was being too rigid. She also said she did not want their first overnight to become an argument between the adults. So she let it happen. I could see the scene without having been there, but I did not pretend to know more than Lauren told me. I knew only that Emmy had cried. Adrian had refused comfort linked to me. Lauren had watched. And she had chosen peace with him. Then came the first bruise. Lauren still maintained Emmy had bumped into the side table. Maybe that part was true. Maybe it was not. She said the collision happened while Emmy was moving too quickly. Through the living room after Adrian told her to put away a toy. I did not seize on it. One bruise did not answer everything. The pattern mattered more. Lauren admitted Adrian had begun grabbing Emmy by the upper arm when she ignored him or moved away while he was speaking. Not striking her. Not in the beginning. Just stopping her physically. Holding her still. Turning her back toward him. Lauren described it as something he did because Emmy was not listening. The language made me furious because I could hear the years of rationalization inside it. I asked whether she told him to stop. She said yes. Once. Afterward. Privately. Adrian told her she was undermining him and teaching Emmy she did not have to respect him. Then he asked the question that kept Lauren silent longer than anything else. Did she actually want to be a family? Or was she still letting me control her daughter? The trap was elegant. If Lauren defended Emmy's attachment to me, she proved Adrian right that she had not reclaimed her role. If she backed Adrian, she proved herself to him. She chose to prove herself. Again. By then my coffee had gone cold. Neither of us had touched much of what we ordered. I asked when the marks on Emmy's back appeared. Lauren's hands began trembling. That was when I knew the photograph was close. She told me the second overnight was worse from the beginning. Emmy had arrived quiet. She checked the rules constantly. She asked before touching food. She wanted to know when I would pick her up before she had even taken off her shoes. Adrian noticed. He called it attitude. Lauren called it nervousness. Their disagreement followed Emmy through the evening. At some point, Emmy called me Mom while asking whether she could phone me. Adrian refused the call. Emmy cried. Lauren tried to intervene. Adrian accused her of undoing everything they had been working toward. Then Lauren said the sentence I had been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting for it. I saw him grab her. The coffee shop around me vanished. Lauren said Adrian caught Emmy by both upper arms when she tried to move past him. He pulled her back. Hard. Hard enough that Emmy cried out. Lauren stepped between them. Adrian let go. Later, when Lauren helped Emmy change, she saw marks already forming along one arm and darker bruising across the upper back from what Lauren described as another struggle near the hallway wall. I did not ask for graphic detail. I did not need it. The photograph already existed in my memory. Lauren had seen the same skin, in person, before I did. I asked what she did next. Lauren covered her mouth with one hand. For the first time that morning, she looked ashamed instead of frightened. She said she waited until Adrian went to sleep. Then she went into Emmy's room. Emmy was awake. Lauren helped her lift the back of her pajama top and took the photograph. Emmy asked why. Lauren told her she needed to remember what the marks looked like. That explained Emmy's reaction. "You got the picture?" She had known exactly when it was taken. I asked Lauren how she sent it. She had an inexpensive prepaid phone she had purchased several weeks earlier because Adrian had started checking the activity on her regular phone more closely. She had kept it hidden in her car and used it only when she felt she needed privacy. The unknown number. Not a mystery device. Not a stranger. Lauren. She sent the picture to me because she knew I would act. The words came out almost as a plea. "I knew you'd know what to do." Something inside me went cold. There it was, the second abandonment. 6 years earlier, Lauren had appeared at my apartment exhausted and frightened, and handed me an 8-month-old baby, because she believed I would know what to do. Now she had done it again. Only this time, she had not left a diaper bag. She left me the consequences. I asked why she did not call for help herself. Why she did not take Emmy out of the house. Why she did not report Adrian. Lauren's answers arrived in the language of someone trying to make fear sound like circumstance. She had nowhere prepared to go. The house was Adrian's as much as hers. She did not know what would happen if she accused him, and the allegation went nowhere. She was afraid he would say she had become unstable. She was afraid of the marriage collapsing. Afraid of losing the life she had built. Afraid he would discover she had lied to him all over again. This time about what she thought of his behavior. Every fear Lauren named was real. Losing the house, the marriage, the life she had built, and the possibility that Adrian would turn the situation against her. None of those fears belonged on Emmy's shoulders. When I asked when she had first known something was wrong, Lauren admitted it began before the second overnight with Adrian's anger over the word mom, the way he corrected Lauren after visits, and the way he once tightened his hand around Emmy's wrist when she pulled away. She had renamed each warning until the bruises made renaming impossible. Lauren began to cry. I did not comfort her. For years I had softened her absence for Emmy, and for our family, partly to protect a child from feeling unwanted, and partly, I could finally admit, to protect Lauren from being named accurately. Now she wanted me to do the same thing again by hiding how early she had known. I would not. Now she was asking me to do it again. The request came carefully. She said the investigators needed to know the photograph existed. They needed to know Adrian had hurt Emmy. But she did not think they needed to know exactly when she first became concerned. She wanted me to say only that the picture arrived anonymously and let everything else come out without her name attached to it. For a second, I simply stared at her. Lauren mistook my silence for uncertainty. She said if Adrian learned she had taken the photo, he would know she had betrayed him. If the court learned she had seen warning signs earlier, they might decide she had failed Emmy too. There it was again. The calculation. Not Emmy's safety. Lauren's position. Lauren's marriage. Lauren's access. Lauren's story. I heard my own voice become very quiet. You want me to protect you from knowing. Her face crumpled. She said she was scared. I believed her. That was no longer enough. Being afraid explains why you hesitated. It doesn't make Emmy responsible for what your fear cost her. Lauren looked at me as if I had struck her. I hated that part of me. Still recognized my little sister in her face. I hated that the recognition did not change the answer. I told her I would not lie. I would not invent anything. I would not exaggerate. I would not tell investigators what I did not know. But if I was asked when Lauren first showed signs of concern, I would answer truthfully. If I was asked who sent the photograph once Lauren's role was established, I would not hide it. And I would not help her rewrite another version of what happened just because this version hurt more. Lauren pushed her cup away. Her hands were shaking badly now. She said I did not understand Adrian. Maybe I didn't. She said if he found out she had talked to me, if he found out she took the picture, everything would change. The marriage, the house, the future she had built. She looked toward the coffee shop entrance again, then back at me. If you tell them everything, he'll know I betrayed him. That was the moment something inside me finally became simple. Lauren had spent the entire morning describing what Adrian had done to Emmy, what he had demanded of Lauren, what he had taken from both of them. And still, when the truth finally required a price, the first person Lauren measured it against was herself. I stood. I did not give her a speech. There was nothing left to explain. She had asked the wrong question from the beginning. Not what would happen to Emmy if she stayed silent. Not how much more a 6-year-old should have to absorb so adults could keep their lives intact. Only this. What happens to me if I speak? Lauren sat there with both hands wrapped around a cold cup, waiting for me to save her from the answer. For the second time in 6 years, my sister had placed the hardest part of motherhood in my hands. The first time, she left me a baby. This time, she left me the consequences. By the time I left the coffee shop, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. Lauren had finally told me enough of the truth to help protect Emmy, and she still wanted me to carry the price of telling it. That was the part I could no longer do for her. For years, I had mistaken mercy for silence. I had softened Lauren's absence when I talked to Mom. I had softened it when Emmy became old enough to ask where her biological mother was. Even after the lawsuit started, some part of me still believed I could protect Emmy without destroying what little image of Lauren remained intact. The photograph ended that illusion. The conversation in the coffee shop buried it. I called Tessa from my car before driving back to work. I gave her the facts in the same stripped-down order I had learned to use since the bruises appeared. Lauren admitted she had sent the photograph. Lauren admitted Adrian had physically grabbed Emmy. Lauren admitted she had seen warning signs before the second overnight. Lauren admitted she had delayed speaking because she feared Adrian and feared what telling the truth would do to her marriage and her position in the custody case. Tessa did not celebrate. That mattered. She told me the information was serious and that Lauren's own statement could become important, but only if Lauren was willing to say it where it counted. A private confession to me was not the same as a sworn statement, a formal interview, or testimony subject to scrutiny. That sentence became the next uncertainty. Lauren had told me the truth because she was frightened. Would she still tell it when Adrian could hear? The protective review came quickly after that, but not magically. There were calls, scheduling, updated reports, June's observations, the school notes, documentation of the injuries. Tessa compressed most of the legal mechanics for me because by then she understood I did not need another lecture on procedure. I needed to know what each step meant for Emmy. The answer was simple enough. The overnight visits remained stopped. Rebecca Hale still had guardianship. Adrian's contact with Emmy was under scrutiny, and the upcoming hearing could decide whether the reunification process continued at all in anything resembling its current form. That was enough. What happened outside those facts was mostly waiting. Adrian used the waiting well. His side responded exactly the way I should have expected. He did not deny that Emmy had bruises. Denying what had already been documented would have made him look foolish. Instead, he attacked the story around them. According to the position communicated through the legal process, I had always opposed Lauren's return. I had resented Emmy's attachment to her biological mother. I had tracked ordinary childhood behavior and transformed it into accusations. The anonymous photograph, they suggested, had arrived at precisely the moment I needed something dramatic enough to stop reunification. Adrian did not need to call me a liar. He only needed to make me look like a woman who had spent 6 years being Emmy's mother and could not tolerate sharing the role. Adrian's argument frightened me because it touched something true. I had been jealous and afraid of losing my place in Emmy's life. What mattered was what I had done with that fear. I had continued supporting contact, accepted longer visits, and allowed an overnight until the safety concerns became concrete. The record showed restraint more clearly than any speech could. Tessa reminded me of that whenever anger started pulling me toward the wrong fight. "You don't have to prove you liked any of this," she told me. "You only have to tell the truth about what you did." So that became my rule. No speeches about Lauren abandoning Emmy. No dramatic retelling of 5 missed Christmases. No listing every fever I had stayed awake through as if motherhood could be invoiced. Those things mattered to me. I had to keep the hearing centered on Emmy, rather than on what Lauren or Adrian deserved. That distinction kept me from turning every old grievance into evidence. The evidence, when laid out by people other than me, had more power precisely because it did not depend on my anger. Mrs. Park described a child who had become increasingly permission-seeking and apologetic after visits expanded. She had dates, ordinary classroom examples, and no history of conflict with Lauren or Adrian. June described divided loyalty, excessive concern over adult consequences, and Emmy's tendency to minimize distress rather than seek help. She was careful not to overstate what Emmy had told her. That restraint made every observation more credible. The injury documentation established that the pattern of bruising deserved investigation and was not neatly explained by one accidental collision. The visitation chronology showed when the behavioral changes intensified. My notes showed the first small bruise, Lauren's explanation, the later conversation about Emmy being dramatic around rules, and the sequence leading to the photograph. And then there was Lauren. Everything eventually came back to Lauren. She was the only person in that room who could explain why the photograph existed. The hearing itself lasted much less time than the emotional weight I had assigned to it. That surprised me. I had imagined it for days as some enormous reckoning. In reality, the room looked almost aggressively ordinary. Fluorescent lights, water pitchers, folders opened and closed. People speaking in controlled voices because the system had no obligation to match the volume of my fear. Adrian sat beside his attorney with the same calm posture he had worn in Mom's backyard. Lauren sat nearby, not quite beside him, not quite separate. I noticed that immediately. When I entered, she looked at me once, and then down. I did not know whether she regretted the coffee shop or feared what came next. Maybe both. The discussion moved through the record efficiently. I answered questions about my guardianship, the reunification schedule, the changes I had observed, and the photograph. I did not speculate about who caused each bruise. I said what I knew and stopped where knowledge ended. At one point, Adrian's side pressed on my feelings about Lauren returning. It was almost elegant. Had I been upset when Emmy first called Lauren Mom? Yes. Had I ever worried Lauren would replace me? Yes. Had I written notes about Emmy's behavior after visits? Yes. The shape of the argument was obvious. A jealous guardian manufactures danger. For 1 second, I wanted to fight the premise. I wanted to say that after 6 years I had earned the right to be jealous. Instead, I answered the better question. I had been afraid of losing my place in Emmy's life. June's observations, Mrs. Park's dates, the injury documentation, my chronology, and the sequence of the visits did not produce one theatrical piece of proof. Together they formed the pattern. And the one person who could explain why the photograph existed was Lauren. The truth had become strong because so many small things pointed in the same direction. Then Lauren was asked about the photograph. I stopped breathing correctly. Her first answer was careful. Too careful. She said she had become concerned during the second overnight. Technically true. She said Emmy had been upset. Also true. She said tensions in the house had been high. True again. I watched her building the softened version in real time. Not a lie exactly. Something worse. A truth trimmed until the parts that could wound Lauren were gone. My chest tightened. For one horrible moment, I thought the coffee shop had changed nothing. Lauren continued. She said she had noticed bruising and had felt uncertain about whether it was accidental. She had wanted someone outside the home to look at the situation. Still no Adrian. Still no earlier warning signs. Still no admission that she had already watched him physically control Emmy. I looked at Tessa. She did not react. That steadiness helped me remain still. Then Lauren was asked directly whether she had taken the photograph. Her eyes moved toward Adrian. The movement was small. Anybody who had not watched her for weeks might have missed it. I did not. That look had been present since the backyard. Before she answered me, she looked at Adrian. Before changing a phone response, she listened for Adrian. Before deciding what version of events to use, she measured him. I saw the habit activate again. Adrian met her gaze. He did not glare. He did not threaten. He barely moved. That was the power he had built. He no longer needed to instruct her. Lauren already knew what answer preserved him. For several seconds, she looked frozen inside that old reflex. Then something changed. She looked away from Adrian. Not toward me. Not toward the judge. Down at her own hands. When she looked up again, she corrected herself. She said yes. She had taken the photograph. The air in the room seemed to sharpen. Lauren explained that she used a separate prepaid phone because Adrian had begun monitoring her regular communication more closely. Then she admitted the part she had avoided. She had been concerned before the photograph. She described Adrian becoming increasingly rigid about Emmy's attachment to me. She acknowledged seeing him use physical force to hold Emmy still. She admitted she had watched Emmy become afraid of breaking rules and had minimized it because she did not want conflict in her marriage. The words came unevenly, not beautifully, not like redemption. At one point she nearly slipped back into justification, describing Adrian as stressed and herself as confused. Then she stopped. She said she had been afraid of losing him. That fear had affected what she did, and she had waited too long. I looked at Adrian. For the first time since I met him, his face was not arranged perfectly. The change was tiny. His jaw tightened. One hand flattened against the table. Nothing dramatic. But control had always been his disguise. Now, finally, something existed in the room that he had not been allowed to control before it arrived. Lauren's truth. I expected to feel triumphant. I felt sick, because every sentence that weakened Adrian also confirmed what Emmy had lived through while Lauren remained silent. The hearing did not become an execution. No one announced Adrian guilty of a crime. No one handed me permanent victory. The immediate decision was protective, not final. The reunification overnights were stopped. Adrian was not to have contact with Emmy while the investigation continued and the appropriate protective conditions remained in place. My guardianship stayed intact during the continuing review. Future contact between Lauren and Emmy would be controlled rather than expanding automatically. Those were the practical results. I heard them as breathing room. Not justice. Not yet. Breathing room. Outside the room, Lauren did not approach me. Adrian did not either. They left separately enough that I noticed. Tessa stood with me for a few minutes and reviewed what would happen next in broad terms. There would still be an investigation. Lauren's admission had consequences for her too. Adrian's conduct would have to be evaluated beyond the family case. Nothing that happened that morning erased the months ahead. I nodded. All I could think about was picking up Emmy. Diane was waiting at my house when I got back. She had been with Emmy during the hearing. I found Mom at the kitchen counter, cutting strawberries into quarters while Emmy sat nearby, coloring a picture of a dog with green ears. The normality nearly undid me. Emmy looked up and asked whether I was staying home now. I told her yes. No explanation beyond that. She went back to coloring. Mom watched me over the cutting board. She waited until Emmy carried the picture to her room before asking what happened. I gave her the short version. Overnight stopped. Adrian no contact. Guardianship remained with me. Lauren told the truth. Mom's shoulders dropped. For a second I thought she might cry. Instead, she pressed the flat of the knife against the cutting board and stared at the strawberry juice running into the grooves. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller than usual. She said she had wanted so badly for Lauren's return to mean their family was healing. I knew. That desire had shaped everything she said in those first weeks. People deserve second chances. Emmy deserves to know her mother. Mom had wanted Lauren's return to mean the family was healing. Some of her early advice had even been reasonable, which made the mistake harder to face. This time, she did not ask me to excuse her intentions. Adults can deserve second chances, she said. Children should never have to pay for them. She finally understood that reconciliation could not be bought with Emmy's safety. That mattered. Mom had spent weeks asking whether Lauren deserved another chance. Now, for the first time, she was asking what that chance had cost Emmy. I reached across the counter and covered her hand. We did not need to say more. Later that evening, Mom left after helping with dinner. Emmy seemed lighter once she knew she was not going anywhere that night. Not happy exactly, less alert. She ate macaroni with too much cheese, complained that I had cut the apple slices too thin, and watched half a movie before falling asleep against the couch cushion. I carried her to bed. At 6, she was still light enough for me to do it without waking her completely, though her legs hung awkwardly now, and reminded me she would not be little forever. I laid her down and pulled the blanket over her. For the first time since the photograph, I allowed myself to think, she's home. Not for one night, because I broke a rule. Not because Adrian allowed it. Not because Lauren changed her mind. There was an actual protective order around the situation now. Adults outside our family had looked at the evidence and agreed that the old arrangement could not continue. I stood beside her bed and breathed. Then I saw the duffel bag. It was pushed partly underneath the bed, the same small overnight bag I had packed with her before the visits. I had not noticed it since she returned. For a second, I assumed it was empty. I bent down and pulled it free. The zipper was closed. I opened it. Inside were pajamas, a toothbrush, 2 shirts, socks, and 1 folded pair of leggings. Packed. Ready. My stomach dropped. Emmy stirred behind me. I turned. Her eyes were open. She saw the bag in my hands. I asked gently why it was still packed. She did not look embarrassed. That somehow made it worse. I left it ready, just in case. 3 words, just in case. That was when I understood the limit of everything we had accomplished that day. The court could stop an overnight. June could document fear. Lauren could finally tell the truth. Adrian could lose access. I could bring Emmy back into the room where her stuffed fox still waited against the pillow. None of it could force her to believe she was staying. I had spent weeks trying to get my daughter home. Now, I had to teach her that home was not something she needed to stay packed to lose. The bag stayed packed for 9 more days. I did not move it. That was harder than it sounds. Every morning I saw the edge of it under Emmy's bed when I opened the curtains. Every evening I noticed it when I knelt to pick up a sock or retrieve a book. I could have unpacked it in less than 2 minutes. Pajamas in the second drawer. Toothbrush in the bathroom cup. Socks matched and folded. Leggings back on the shelf. I could have restored order. But the bag was not disorder. It was insurance. Emmy had built herself a small emergency exit out of fabric and zippers, and taking it apart because it frightened me would have solved nothing for her. So I left it. Instead, I watched what happened around it. There were 3 things I noticed most after the hearing. The first was food. Emmy had always been casual about the kitchen. If she was hungry before dinner, she knew which snacks she could take without asking. Yogurt, apple slices, cheese sticks, crackers from the lower cabinet. She had rules, but they were ordinary rules, the kind that lived in routine rather than fear. Now she asked, every time, "Can I have this? Is it okay if I take one? Can I get water?" The first few times, I answered automatically. Then I realized what I was hearing. Not politeness, permission. Permission for needs she had never needed to justify before. The second thing was the question, was I good today? At first she asked after school, then after dinner. Once, after spending an hour at Mom's house, helping water the basil, she asked it while I buckled her into the car. There was no misbehavior to explain. No context, just the need for a verdict. The third thing was the bag. Food, goodness, readiness to leave. I could have turned all 3 into a new case file if I wanted to. I didn't. By then, I had learned the danger of looking at Emmy only through the lens of what had happened to her. She was still 6. She still forgot where she put her shoes. She still believed the blue cup made orange juice taste better. She still built entire imaginary families out of crayons and tape. If I treated every silence like trauma, and every question like evidence, I would turn home into another place where adults studied her behavior. So, I tried to return normality to the rooms without pretending everything was normal. That balance was harder than any hearing. The first week after the protective order, I made mistakes. Most of them came from love. That did not make them harmless. I checked on Emmy too often. At bedtime, I asked if she was okay. At breakfast, I asked how she slept. When she came home from school, I asked whether anything had bothered her. If she went quiet in the car, I asked what she was thinking. If she rubbed her arm, I asked if it hurt. If she took too long in the bathroom, I knocked. None of the questions sounded unreasonable by themselves. Together, they became another kind of pressure. I saw it one evening while she was coloring at the kitchen table. She had been unusually quiet. I asked if she was okay. She nodded. 5 minutes later, she sighed. I asked whether something happened at school. She shook her head. Then she broke a brown crayon and stared at the 2 pieces. I asked if she wanted to talk about Lauren. Her shoulders rose. No. I told myself to stop. 10 minutes later, she pushed the coloring book away. I asked if she was tired. That was when she snapped. Stop asking me. The words came out louder than anything she had said to me in days. Then she froze. Her face changed instantly. The anger disappeared. In its place came fear. Not fear of me hurting her. Something smaller and more devastating. Fear that anger itself had broken a rule. I saw her eyes move toward the hallway, toward her room, toward the packed bag under the bed. I wanted to reassure her immediately. I also knew a long speech would turn her outburst into another event, so I swallowed every sentence I had prepared. I said okay. Then I picked up the broken crayon, set both pieces beside the coloring book, and went back to rinsing dishes. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. That evening taught me something uncomfortable about protection. Adrian had monitored behavior to control Emmy. I was beginning to monitor feelings because I was terrified of missing danger again. The motives were different, but a 6-year-old could still experience both as an adult, constantly checking whether she was behaving the right way. I needed to stay alert without making Emmy prove she was okay. The next morning I did not ask how she slept. I made toast and asked whether she wanted strawberry jam or peanut butter. She chose strawberry. For the first time in days, breakfast belonged only to breakfast. That became my new discipline. I did not stop watching. I stopped making Emmy responsible for proving she was okay. June supported that approach when we spoke later in the week. She reminded me that safety was not simply the absence of danger. A child also needed the freedom to have ordinary moods, without adults reacting as though every one of them meant something terrible. I understood. The problem was that ordinary moods had become difficult for me to trust. Emmy became angry more often. Not dramatically. She did not scream for hours or break things. She became sharp around the edges. She complained about small rules she had accepted for years. She did not want to brush her teeth. She argued about bedtime. She refused one morning to wear the coat she had chosen herself 10 minutes earlier. At first, I wondered whether I should feel relieved. Anger meant she was no longer trying to be perfect. Then one evening, she aimed the anger directly at me. We were putting away laundry. I had stopped folding her shirts for her, because normal responsibility was part of home too. She was doing a terrible job of it, pushing shirts into the drawer in loose bundles. I let her. Then she found the paper crown Lauren had made with her during one of those first supervised visits. It had fallen behind a stack of pajamas. Emmy lifted it carefully. The room changed. She looked at the crown for a long time. Then she asked when she could see Lauren again. I told her the adults handling the situation were still deciding what contact would be safe and appropriate. She hated that answer. I could see it before she spoke. You made her tell. The sentence was not entirely logical. 6-year-old sentences about adult cases rarely are. But I knew what she meant. Lauren had told the truth. The truth had changed everything. And I had refused to protect Lauren from the consequences. I sat on the floor beside the dresser. I told Emmy that Lauren made her own choices about what to say. She shook her head. You wanted her to. Yes, I had. Because the truth mattered. Because Emmy mattered. Because Lauren's fear did not get to decide what happened next. I could have explained all of that. Instead, I said I wanted the adults to tell the truth about what happened. Emmy's mouth tightened. Then she said the thing I had known was coming since the day she accused me of not wanting her to have another mom. Now she doesn't have Adrian. I looked at her. There was grief in the sentence. Not for Adrian. For Lauren's life. The house. The marriage. The idea of the family Emmy had briefly been invited into. I realized something then that I should have understood sooner. From Emmy's perspective, the story did not look like this. Adrian hurt me. Rebecca saved me. Lauren failed me. Children rarely sort love into clean moral boxes. Her version looked more like this. Lauren came back. Lauren wanted me. Adrian had rules. Things went wrong. Rebecca found out. Lauren lost Adrian. Everything broke. And somewhere inside that sequence, Emmy still believed she might be the reason. I told her adults were responsible for their own choices. She turned away. You made everything worse. The words landed because I had known protecting Emmy could hurt, but I had not imagined she might wish I had done less. I wanted to defend myself with everything that was not my fault. Instead, I let her anger exist. Asking a 6-year-old to understand the legal and moral reasons behind my choices would have made her carry another adult burden. I did not add anything else. She put the crown on her shelf instead of throwing it away. I took that as instruction. Lauren was not being erased, not from the room, not from Emmy, and I was not going to make her choose. A few days later, that choice became explicit. Emmy was eating cereal when she asked if Lauren was okay. I said I did not know everything about Lauren's day-to-day life, but she was safe from what I had been told. Emmy pushed a piece of cereal around the bowl. Then she asked, very quietly, "Is it bad if I miss her?" The answer came more easily than I expected. Missing someone doesn't mean what they did was okay. She looked at me. I did not tell her she should miss Lauren. I did not tell her she should not. I did not explain forgiveness or responsibility or adult relationships. She was 6. She needed permission for one feeling. So I gave it to her. She finished breakfast. That was all. Later, I realized her question about missing Lauren applied to me too. I sometimes missed the sister who had slept sideways in my bed during thunderstorms and stolen my sweaters as a teenager. Missing that version of Lauren did not erase what the adult Lauren had done. It simply made room for grief, without turning grief into permission. Diane changed around that time. She stopped talking about reconciliation altogether, not because she had given up on Lauren, because she finally understood that Emmy should not be the instrument of anybody else's redemption. When she visited, she no longer asked whether Emmy wanted to call Lauren or whether she thought the family might someday be together again. She asked simpler things. What does she need from us? Sometimes the answer was nothing. Sometimes it was pancakes. Sometimes it was an afternoon where nobody said Lauren's name. Mom learned to accept that. The most important change came from something small enough that I almost missed it. It happened on a Sunday morning. I was in the laundry room, folding towels, when I heard a crash in the kitchen. Not a dangerous sound. Ceramic. I hurried in. Emmy was standing beside the counter. A small bowl had fallen to the tile and cracked into 3 pieces. Cereal scattered around her bare feet. She looked at me. Her face emptied. Then her eyes filled. Not because she loved the bowl, because she knew she had broken something. Her hands went behind her back. I stopped several feet away. I asked if she was hurt. She shook her head. Then she said, "I wasn't supposed to carry it." That was true. I had told her before not to carry ceramic bowls across the kitchen when she could use the lighter plastic ones. There was a rule. She had broken it. A normal rule. A normal consequence. But Emmy was not waiting for a normal consequence. She was waiting for something else. I saw it in the way she did not move, in the way she watched my face, in the way her eyes flicked toward the hallway. The bag. Again. I took a broom from the closet and told her to step back so she would not cut her feet. She obeyed. I swept the broken pieces into a dustpan. Then I handed her a towel for the cereal. She looked confused. I told her she still needed to help clean up because she had carried the wrong bowl after I asked her not to. She nodded. Her eyes stayed on me. When the floor was clean, I put the broken pieces in the trash. Emmy whispered that she was sorry. I told her I knew. Then I said, "We fix mistakes. We don't throw people away." She stared at me. No dramatic tears, no hug, just stillness. Then she asked whether she could have another bowl of cereal. I almost laughed. I got her a plastic one. She ate at the table while I finished the towels. Something changed after that morning. Not everything. The bag stayed packed. She still asked permission more than she used to. But 2 days later, I caught her opening the refrigerator and taking a yogurt without asking. She noticed me watching. For 1 second, I thought she might put it back. She didn't. She peeled the lid and sat down. I said nothing. The next week, Mrs. Park told me Emmy had been corrected for talking during quiet reading time. My body tensed before I could stop it. Then, Mrs. Park smiled. Emmy had rolled her eyes. Actually rolled them. The kind of small, disrespectful gesture adults normally dislike. I nearly cried from relief. Mrs. Park understood immediately. For months, every adult in Emmy's life had been worried because she was too good. That day, a tiny piece of ordinary childhood had returned. At home, I still gave her the appropriate consequence for ignoring classroom rules. No extra screen time that evening. She complained. Loudly. Then she stomped down the hallway. I stood in the kitchen listening to her bedroom door close harder than necessary. 5 minutes later, she came out and asked what was for dinner. No apology. No question about whether she was staying. I had never been so grateful for bad manners in my life. That night, I looked under the bed. The duffel bag was still there, packed. Healing does not move in straight lines. I was beginning to understand that too. You do not remove fear one beautiful conversation at a time until a child becomes who she was before. Sometimes healing looks like taking yogurt without permission. Sometimes it looks like rolling your eyes at a teacher. Sometimes it looks like getting angry at the mother who saved you because you finally believe she will still be there after the anger is over. I stopped measuring progress by gratitude. That freed both of us. Weeks passed. The protective arrangement remained in place. Adrian still had no contact with Emmy. His conduct was being handled through channels I did not control and did not need to narrate to Emmy. Lauren's situation was more complicated. She was no longer living with Adrian in the same way she had before the hearing, but separation from him did not automatically make her ready to resume motherhood. There were conditions, evaluations, boundaries, accountability. Emmy occasionally asked about her. I answered what I could. I never used Lauren as a threat. I never used her as a lesson. I did not say, "This is what happens when adults fail you." I had spent enough years turning adult choices into child-safe language. Now, I was learning the difference between softening truth and refusing to weaponize it. Then Tessa called one afternoon while I was driving home from work. She told me the final guardianship review had been scheduled. The date was several weeks away. The purpose was not to relive every detail. The court needed to decide what long-term arrangement best protected Emmy's stability and what future role, if any, Lauren should have under controlled conditions. I parked in my driveway and sat with the engine off. For months, I had imagined the final review as a finish line. Now it felt different. I already knew what I wanted legally. Stability, safety, no return to the old uncertainty. But there was one question I could not answer for Lauren. Would she keep fighting for the title of mother because losing it meant admitting what she had done? Or would she finally understand that loving Emmy might require giving up control over what Emmy called home? Inside the house, Emmy was waiting for me. I found her at the kitchen table, drawing another house. This one had 3 windows, a crooked chimney, and a tree beside the front steps. I noticed something I had not seen in months. No suitcase by the door. No question about where she was going tomorrow. Just a 6-year-old with green crayon on 2 fingers, arguing with herself about whether the roof should be purple or blue. The final review was coming. Lauren would get one more chance to decide what motherhood meant, when there was nothing left to win. And this time, Emmy would not be the price of her answer. By the time we returned to court for the final guardianship review, I no longer wanted Lauren defeated. That surprised me. Months earlier, I had imagined the end of this story as a clean reversal. Lauren would walk in, claiming motherhood, and walk out, having lost the right to threaten Emmy's home. Adrian would be exposed. The adults who had failed Emmy would finally understand what they had done, and I would leave with something official enough to silence every doubt forever. I had been thinking like someone who wanted an ending. Children do not heal in endings. They heal in mornings, in predictable rides to school, in knowing which cabinet holds the cereal, in being corrected for talking during quiet reading and discovering nobody sends them away afterward, in having a bad mood on Tuesday and still being asked on Wednesday whether they want pancakes. By the day of the review, those things mattered to me more than seeing Lauren punished. That did not mean consequences had stopped mattering. It meant I had finally learned the difference between consequences and revenge. The courtroom looked exactly as ordinary as it had the last time. Nothing about fluorescent lights or polished wood acknowledged that a 6-year-old's understanding of home had been argued over for months. Emmy was not there. That had been deliberate. Diane took her to school that morning and promised to pick her up afterward. Emmy knew there was another grown-up meeting about the schedule. She knew she would sleep in her own bed that night. That was all she needed. Before I left the house, she stood at the kitchen counter, spreading too much jam across toast, and asked whether I would be home before dinner. I told her yes. She accepted the answer and licked jam from her thumb. Months earlier, she would have asked what happened if I was late, whether somebody else would collect her, whether she needed to pack anything. That morning, she only reminded me that Friday was library day, and she needed help finding the book she had misplaced. I carried that ordinary request into court with me. Lauren arrived without Adrian. I knew they were no longer living together as husband and wife in the same house, but I had tried not to turn Lauren's separation into another story I watched too closely. Whatever she was doing to rebuild her life belonged to her unless it affected Emmy. She looked different, not transformed, not suddenly stronger. Lauren looked different without Adrian beside her. Not redeemed, not transformed, simply less arranged. When our eyes met, neither of us smiled. I no longer needed hatred to prove that what she had done mattered, and letting go of hatred did not require me to lower a single boundary around Emmy. Lauren withdrew that fight. She did not make a grand speech about motherhood. She did not tell the room she had finally understood everything. She acknowledged that she was not asking for Emmy to be placed with her, and that any future contact should follow the recommendations already in place, structured, supervised, and dependent on Emmy's well-being rather than Lauren's desire to repair her image. I watched her while she said it. Her voice shook once. She continued, "That was enough. I did not need Lauren to become heroic at the end. I needed her to stop making Emmy carry the weight of Lauren's redemption." Lauren withdrew the petition to terminate my guardianship. The guardianship remained in place, and future contact could expand only if it was shown to be safe and appropriate for Emmy. There was no instant adoption, and no sudden transfer of rights. The legal result was stability around the home Emmy already had. I thought I would cry when it became official. I didn't. I exhaled. Sometimes relief is too deep for tears. Outside the courtroom, Tessa spoke to me for a few minutes about what the order meant and what would happen if circumstances changed later. I listened more carefully than I had in the early days, when legal language sounded like a wall between me and Emmy. Now I understood its proper place. The order could create structure. It could stop adults from moving Emmy around according to emotion. It could give me authority to say no when safety required it. But no piece of paper could teach Emmy that she was permanent. That work would happen at home. Lauren was waiting near the elevators when I finished with Tessa. For a moment I considered walking past her. Then she said my name. I stopped. She told me she was sorry, not for everything. Not in the kind of speech that tries to collect 6 years of damage into one apology and call the debt paid. She said she was sorry for making Emmy responsible for fixing the story she had told Adrian. That was more specific than anything she had said before. She admitted she had wanted to reclaim the title of mother before she understood what being one required. I listened. I did not tell her it was okay. It wasn't. I did not tell her I forgave her. I was not sure that word even described what I felt. Lauren asked whether Emmy still missed her. That question put me back on familiar ground. Emmy's feelings. The territory adults had fought over, as if affection could establish ownership. I told Lauren that Emmy's feelings belonged to Emmy. If supervised contact remained appropriate and Emmy wanted it, I would not make her choose between loving Lauren and loving me. Months earlier, that would have felt like surrender. Now I understood that affection was not a verdict, and legal authority did not give me ownership of Emmy's heart. I left the courthouse without asking Lauren what she planned to do next. That was hers. I drove directly to Emmy's school. Diane had already picked her up and was waiting near the playground. Emmy saw my car and waved, but she did not run over in panic. She finished crossing the monkey bars first. That tiny delay felt like victory. When she reached me, she asked whether I found her library book. I had forgotten completely. I told her we would look together after dinner. She groaned as if I had failed at the only important responsibility in my life. I laughed. We went home. The criminal case involving Adrian took months, not days. That mattered to me because Real consequences rarely arrive with the timing of a story. There were additional interviews, review of the injury documentation, Lauren's statements, and the records already gathered around Emmy's changes and the circumstances of the overnights. I was not present for every step, and did not pretend to understand everything happening outside the pieces Tessa explained, or I was formally told. What mattered was that the case did not disappear. Adrian did not walk away simply because he had avoided admitting anything at the family hearing. Eventually, the matter resolved without a dramatic public trial. He accepted a plea on charges connected to the physical harm and child endangerment established through the investigation. The outcome included criminal penalties, mandated conditions, and continued restrictions preventing contact with Emmy. Adrian's criminal case took months, not days. Additional interviews, the injury documentation, Lauren's statements, and the existing record were reviewed before the matter resolved through a plea connected to the physical harm and child endangerment. The outcome carried criminal penalties, mandated conditions, and continued restrictions preventing contact with Emmy. The polished family image he had guarded also fractured, but I did not chase the social fallout. The consequence that mattered most was that he could no longer set the rules of Emmy's life. Lauren's consequences were different. Telling the truth stopped further harm, but it did not restore years of trust or erase the weeks when she had protected her marriage before protecting Emmy. Counseling and supervised contact were beginnings, not a return to the role she wanted. Lauren attended counseling and complied with the conditions around supervised contact. I knew those facts only because they affected the decisions concerning Emmy. I did not monitor Lauren's private progress beyond that. The first time supervised contact resumed, months later, I had to confront one last piece of the old fear. Emmy wanted to go. Not desperately. Not with the bright excitement of those early visits. She thought about it for a long time before deciding. Then she asked whether I would be there afterward. I told her yes, that was enough. When the visit ended, I watched through the glass as Lauren knelt to say goodbye. For a moment, Lauren opened her arms. Emmy hesitated. Then instead of stepping into the hug, she picked up her drawing and walked toward me. Lauren let her. That was the part I noticed. She did not reach again. She did not ask Emmy what was wrong. She did not turn the hesitation into rejection. She allowed the child to set the distance. I could respect that without pretending it repaired everything. On the drive home, Emmy said almost nothing about the visit. I did not ask for a report. She eventually told me Lauren had cut her hair shorter. I said I had noticed. Then Emmy asked whether we could stop for frozen yogurt. That became the entire emotional summary of the afternoon. I was learning to trust what children did not need to turn into declarations. Weeks became months. The duffel bag remained under Emmy's bed. For a while I wondered whether it always would. Then I stopped checking every day. That was part of my healing too. One Thursday evening, Emmy came home from school in a terrible mood. Not traumatized. Not frightened, just 6. Mrs. Park had corrected her for talking during a lesson. Another child had refused to let her use a purple marker. Emmy had forgotten the classroom book she was supposed to bring home, and then it started raining during pickup. By the time she walked through our front door, she was angry at weather, education, markers, and apparently me. She dropped her backpack in the hallway, despite the rule that it belonged on the hook. I told her to put it away. She ignored me and walked toward the kitchen. I called her back. Her entire body seemed to collapse under the injustice of being expected to move a backpack approximately 6 feet. She shoved it onto the hook hard enough that one strap fell off again. Then she started crying. Not delicate tears, the furious kind. I waited. She told me everybody had been mean. I said it sounded like a hard day. That made her angrier. She said she hated hard days. I told her I did too. She stomped to her room. The door closed. Not slammed, but close. 10 minutes later, I found her sitting on the floor beside her bed with the stuffed fox in her lap. I sat near the doorway instead of beside her. She looked exhausted. The anger had burned away and left something more familiar. Was I bad today? The old question. It had become less frequent, which made hearing it again hurt differently. I looked at the backpack still hanging crookedly in the hallway. She had talked during class, ignored me, nearly slammed a door. A few months earlier, I might have rushed to tell her she was good. Now I understood that was not the lesson she needed. She did not need me to erase the mistake. She needed to learn that the mistake and belonging could exist together. You can have a bad day and still belong here. Emmy looked at me. I let the sentence sit between us. She asked whether she still lost screen time for ignoring me. I said yes. Her face twisted in offended disbelief. For a moment, I worried I had destroyed the emotional significance of everything. Then she threw the stuffed fox onto the bed and announced that this was unfair. I almost smiled. Safe motherhood was not the absence of consequences. It was the absence of fear that consequences meant losing love. I told her dinner would be ready in 20 minutes. She asked what we were having. Macaroni. She said she wanted peas too. That was the end of the crisis. A few mornings later, I opened Emmy's closet, looking for a missing jacket. I found the duffel bag on the shelf. Empty. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. I pulled it down. No pajamas. No toothbrush. No emergency socks. Nothing. I checked under the bed. Clear. Her clothes were back in the drawers. The toothbrush had returned to the bathroom cup. The stuffed fox was where it belonged. I had not seen her unpack. She had not announced it. There had been no ceremony. Sometime when I was making dinner or answering an email or folding towels, Emmy had quietly decided she no longer needed to remain ready to leave. I sat on the edge of her bed holding the empty bag. That was when I cried. Not in court. Not when Lauren withdrew the petition. Not when Adrian's case resolved. There, in a messy 6-year-old's bedroom, holding an empty duffel bag. Because for the first time in months, Emmy had behaved as if tomorrow belonged to her. I folded the bag and returned it to the shelf. I did not mention it when she came home. Some victories belong to the child who creates them. That evening we found the missing library book under the couch. Emmy insisted I must have put it there. I pointed out that I had never read a book called The Very Sleepy Raccoon in my life. She remained unconvinced. After dinner, she colored at the kitchen table while I answered 2 work emails. She drew another house. Purple roof, 3 windows, a tree. The same kinds of details she had drawn before Lauren returned. But this time, there was something new. A small figure stood outside the front door. I asked who it was. Me. I looked at the picture. Where are you going? She gave me the same expression she had given me years earlier, when I asked why the people in her drawings lived inside the houses. Nowhere. I live there. I had to look away for a moment. At bedtime, she brushed her teeth, argued over whether 8:30 counted as basically 8, and climbed under the blanket with her stuffed fox. I turned off the lamp. As I reached the doorway, she called after me. Mom? I stopped. Can you wake me up for school tomorrow? The question was so ordinary that once I might not have heard what was missing from it. No asking where she would sleep. No asking who would pick her up. No asking whether Lauren was coming. No asking whether she had been good. Tomorrow was simply school. And I was simply the person who would wake her. 7 o'clock, I told her. She groaned. I closed the door halfway, the way she liked it. For years, I had thought Lauren and I were fighting over which one of us had the right to be Emmy's mother. I was wrong. A child is not something you win. Motherhood was what each adult chose when choosing Emmy cost something. Lauren eventually chose truth. Adrian chose control until it cost him access. Diane learned that a second chance could not be purchased with a child's safety. I had to stop believing protection meant making sure Emmy chose me. The most important thing I ever gave her was not guardianship. It was permission to stop proving she deserved it. Only once. She was sprawled diagonally across the mattress, one foot outside the blanket, the stuffed fox trapped beneath her arm. Her breathing was slow and even. On the shelf above the closet hung the empty overnight bag. I looked at it and understood what had taken me the entire story to learn. Home was never the place Emmy could not leave. Home was the place she no longer had to prepare to lose. She did not have to be good enough to stay. She was already home.